Get access to hundreds more exclusive history documentaries by downloading the History Hit app.
The days and weeks after the battle at Edgehill in October 1642 had probably provided King Charles with his best and perhaps only chance of winning the Civil War outright. He had failed to take it. By November, the Parliamentary army under Essex had managed to slip past the Royalist forces outside London to regain the city, while Charles had established his court at Oxford. Both sides now realized that there would be no speedy end to the English Civil War. Sir Edward Sydenham, a Royalist soldier, wrote to Ralph Verney after the Battle of Edgehill.
For all our great victory, I have had the greatest loss by the death of your noble father that ever any friend did. He himself killed two with his own hands and broke the point of his standard at push of pike before he fell. My humble service to his sad wife. God, in his infinite mercy, comfort you both, shall be the prayers of your friend and servant.
The economic, demographic and financial strength was on one side, the parliamentary side. London and the surrounding counties were agriculturally the most fertile parts of England. London was the source and centre of financing. London was the centre of overseas trade, and at the outset all the major ports and the navy were all under parliamentary control. In contrast, the Royalists were supported by the poorest areas in the country.
After the indecisive Edgehill campaign, both sides settled down for a fairly inactive winter, the winter of 1642 to 43, consolidating their position and ensuring that the counties of England and Wales were firmly secured for King or Parliament and that they could begin to tap their resources.
The winters of the early 1640s were particularly severe, with unnaturally heavy and prolonged falls of snow. With the sudden thaw, the primitive roads of 17th century England quickly turned into muddy quagmires that made movement impossible. The winter, therefore, was a time of small but fierce engagements between detachments and garrisons, while the main field armies waited for the spring and dry roads. All around the country, garrisons were attacked, convoys were ambushed, and a pattern of constant raid and counter-raid was established. As the two sides sought ways to improve their positions for the coming summer campaigns of 1643, they were able to survey the situation around the country. Northumberland and Durham were already held for the king, and the Royalists were pushing southward into the Vale of York. On the other side of the Pennines, Cumberland and Westmoreland were also for the king, but in Lancashire the position was still in some doubt. Royalist supporters, too, dominated Wales, while most of East Anglia had declared for Parliament. In the south, Sir William Waller had captured the Royalist garrison at Winchester shortly before Christmas and was extending his influence into Devon. In the West Country, however, his old friend and future opponent, Sir Ralph Hopton, had secured Cornwall for King Charles. In the all-important areas of the Thames Valley and the Midlands, there was still jockeying for position as both sides prepared for the real war that could only be fought in the spring and summer.
Discover the past with exclusive military history documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians, all on History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go with your mobile device. Download the app now to watch everything, from the gripping story of the Band of Brothers to Operation Barbarossa and D-Day. Immerse yourself in the dramatic stories of this remarkable era by signing up via the link in the description.
There is still some argument among Civil War historians as to whether a Royalist strategy for the year 1643 had actually been formulated.
If the strategy existed, it would have been to bring forces from the north, the Midlands and the southwest, defeat the Parliamentarian field armies in those areas, and eventually move on London, so that by the end of the year, London, the capital and the seat of government, would be back in Royalist hands.
The king needed to advance. They were the ways to advance. The advances would naturally take him towards London, whatever he did. He needed more territory so that he could hem in the parliamentarians, so that he could tap the resources of more of England and Wales for a longer war. So it was the natural, sensible thing to do.
Whatever the truth, as the campaign season of 1643 opened, the king had the initiative. But his army continued to be hampered by a serious shortage of arms and ammunition. Some regiments, for instance, contained many more pikemen than musketeers, a situation that meant Royalist armies would have to rely on brute strength rather than firepower in battle. At the end of February, Queen Henrietta, who had travelled to Holland to pawn the crown jewels and to buy arms with the proceeds, landed at Bridlington in Yorkshire, and the Marquis of Newcastle prepared a great convoy to transport the precious cargo to Oxford. To cover the arrival of this vital arms shipment, Prince Rupert moved into the Midlands on the 3rd of April to storm the defences of Birmingham, and on the 21st of April, after a short siege, he captured Lichfield. The Royalists received a setback, however, when the Earl of Essex struck west and laid siege to Reading. Rupert quickly returned from the Midlands to come to the aid of the town, but he was powerless to prevent the garrison's surrender on the 27th of April, 1643. John Gwynn, a Royalist soldier, wrote,
"A cannon shell came through the guardhouse and knocked off the tiles from the roof. One fell upon the head of Sir Arthur Aston, the governor, and sank him almost to the ground. He faintly said, 'My head's whole, I think,' but spoke no more at that time. He was carried away to his house in the town, where during the rest of the siege he was speechless. A short time after, the garrison was surrendered, and they broke their conditions and plundered us."
With Reading in parliamentary hands, the two main field armies withdrew to their old positions, watching each other warily. The parliamentary army was crippled by a typhus epidemic, the first of many to sweep the three kingdoms in the army's wake. In order to break the deadlock, a major victory was required that would alter the delicate balance in favour of one side or the other. But this was hardly likely to emerge from the pattern of minor battles and skirmishes which characterised the opening months of 1643. The first opportunity to strike a meaningful strategic blow fell to the Royalists. Sir Ralph Hopton, the Royalist leader in the West, drew up his army to face the Parliamentarians, led by Sir William Waller, who in former days had been a close friend. They met at Lansdowne Hill, outside the city of Bath, on the 5th of July. The real tragedy of the Civil War can be clearly seen in the surviving letters between Hopton and Waller, two old friends who found themselves on different sides of a bitter conflict. Waller wrote to Hopton,
Sir, the experience I have had of your worth and the happiness I have enjoyed in your friendship are wounding considerations when I look upon this present distance between us. Certainly my affections to you are so unchangeable that hostility itself cannot violate my friendship to your person, but I must be true to the cause wherein I serve. That great God, which is the searcher of my heart, knows with what a sad sense I go upon this service, and with what a perfect hatred I detest this war without an enemy. But I look upon it as opus domini, which is enough to silence all passion in me. The God of peace in his good time send us peace, and in the meantime fit us to receive it. We are both upon the stage, and must act those parts that are assigned us in this tragedy. Let us do it in a way of honour, and without personal animosities. Whatsoever the issue be, I shall never willingly relinquish the dear title of your most affectionate friend and faithful servant, William Waller.
Lansdowne Hill, near Bath, and Roundway Down near Devizes have to be seen as major victories for the Royalist cause in the southwest. At Lansdowne Hill, the Cornish infantry fought their way up an incredibly steep hill in the face of hostile fire, driving the Parliamentarians off the hill. Unfortunately, they were not in any position to capitalise on this victory, although they did put the Parliamentarians into a position that later on would be advantageous to the Royalist cause. At Devizes, having retired on Devizes after Lansdowne, Hopton's forces pinned Waller around the town, allowing Royalist horse to come from Oxford, and in a battle which saw men plunging over the edge of a precipice, defeat Waller's force.
With the destruction of Waller's army, the last major field army to disrupt the Royalist advance in the southwest is destroyed, and the road is open for the Royalists to roll up not only southwest England but also central southern England, and to threaten the parliamentary heartlands in and around London.
Buoyed up by Hopton's success, the Royalists moved swiftly. A second arms convoy arrived in Oxford 2 days later, and leaving a scattering of garrisons behind them to distract the main Roundhead army, the Royalists began to march on Bristol. There, the city's hastily constructed earth defences were not strong enough to withstand a furious Royalist assault on the 26th of July. The storming of the defences of the city of Bristol was to prove one of the most savage days' fighting of the entire war. Royalist casualties were high.
Rupert put the Cornish infantry on the south side of the town, and he took his own cavalry and foot to the north side of the town, where he noticed a weakness in the defences. The Cornish assaulted on their sector, and Rupert assaulted on their sector. The Cornish took incredible casualties, but that was the nature of the Cornish foot, is they were quite capable of doing that. Rupert managed to get in and started to feed his cavalry into the town. The fortifications were captured, and only after a fight right in the centre of Bristol was the town captured.
One Royalist observer, surveying the dead men piled high on the ramparts, remarked,
"As gallant gentlemen as ever drew sword lay upon that ground, like so many rotten sheep."
Although losses were high at Bristol, the gain to the Royalist cause was incalculable. Bristol was the second city in the kingdom, a major port with sufficient ships still to form the nucleus of a Royalist fleet. Less spectacularly, but no less importantly, the city also had gun manufacturers capable of turning out hundreds of muskets a week. These were greatly welcomed by the undersupplied Royalists. By the end of the war, most Royalist infantry regiments were wholly armed with Bristol-made muskets. With Bristol secure, the King's advisers advocated turning immediately to attack London. But Charles again hesitated, and instead he decided to first capture Gloucester, the last remaining major parliamentary stronghold in the west. So confident was Charles of victory that he allocated a portion of his precious forces to undertake a simultaneous siege of Exeter. After capturing these two Roundhead strongholds, it was planned that the combined Royalist armies would then advance on London.
Gloucester was an important town and port in the Civil War. It was a fairly flourishing port. It was the lowest bridgeable point of the River Severn. It stood on an important crossroads, road crossroads. So it has a strategic social economic importance in the Civil War. The King couldn't exploit the rich Thames Valley because Parliament held London and that blocked that route. It's possible that he could have exploited the Severn Valley as an alternative artery of trade and commerce, manufacture and production, and thus got ongoing money raked off through excise and taxes and duties to finance his war effort. He couldn't really do that, though, while Parliament held Gloucester. That blocked up the Severn Valley and made a mess of those plans of the Royalists to exploit the Severn Valley, disrupting trade, commerce, movement of goods. And hence there is an argument for the King making a determined effort to get Gloucester and thus fully to open up the Severn Estuary and the Severn Valley as an alternative to London and the Thames Valley.
This time, King Charles determined the way in which Gloucester should be captured. Sickened by the losses at Bristol, he would not permit the town to be stormed, preferring instead to starve the defenders into submission. The governor of Gloucester, Colonel Massey, however, confounded the king's plan by holding out, and, in doing so, thwarted Charles's great design for 1643.
The problem with Gloucester is that it was well defended. It had Roman and rebuilt medieval defences, quite a small defensive circuit. And although its dynamic parliamentarian defender, Massey, probably only had 1,500 men, that was perfectly adequate to hold off a much larger Royalist army, particularly a Royalist army that for much of the siege lacked sufficient heavy artillery to blow holes in the masonry walls. And thus, the siege of Gloucester, conducted in very bad weather, which also hampered the King's operation, turned out to be something of a disaster for the King. He fails, he moves away, he wastes time at Gloucester.
With the breathing space gained from the protracted siege of Gloucester, the Earl of Essex was able to assemble a relief force by filling out his typhus-ravaged ranks with several regiments of militia from London. Despite their somewhat dubious quality, Essex raised the siege of Gloucester on the 4th of September. It was not a moment too soon. The garrison was down to a single barrel of gunpowder. Essex was to throw away his success by once again allowing the Royalist army to get between him and his base at London, and the King was able to force Essex to fight his next battle on ground of his own choosing. The two forces met on the 20th of September at Newbury.
The outcome of the Battle of Newbury was indecisive. There was terrible, terrible fierce fighting. Lots of senior Royalist officers were killed leading the men into the fighting. But the actual result was indecisive. The Royalists held the best position, but they were desperately low on ammunition, with very little hope of more coming. So Charles decided to pull back. What motivated him most was to preserve his army as a body and yet give Essex the reward of getting back to London.
The outcome of the battle really wasn't much good for Charles. The battle was a failure for the king. And many historians, if we're looking for a turning point in the Civil War, many historians linking Gloucester and Newbury in summer 1643 see this as a turning point. The king's failure to capture Gloucester, wasting time as it turned out at Gloucester, the king's failure then to advance quickly on London, the king's stalemate, being forced back at Newbury, meant that a real opportunity was lost, and this was a turning point in terms of Royalist morale. If Parliament can raise almost a new army and march it out from London, can relieve Gloucester, can then get between us and London, can repulse us at Newbury, then a chance has gone. Can we ever really beat them?
While the king and his nephew struggled for control of the west of England during 1643, the war continued to rage in the north. The campaigns here featured two of the Civil War's most colourful characters. They were William Cavendish, the Earl of Newcastle for the Royalists, and Sir Thomas Fairfax, 3rd Baron of Cameron, the Parliamentary commander. Newcastle was a fabulously wealthy landowner who was the principal supporter of the king's cause in the north. Probably the wealthiest man in England at the outbreak of the war, he had been appointed general of king's forces north of the Trent in 1642, a position that probably owed more to his ownership of large areas of the northern lands than to any great military skills. Nonetheless, Newcastle served Charles well, and with no little success during the early years of the war. Fairfax, known as Black Tom for his dark hair and brooding looks, was one of the outstanding soldier politicians of the Civil War. Hindered by poor quality troops when war broke out, he proved himself to be a fine commander and military strategist even in defeat, and it was he, with his father Ferdinando, who waged war against Newcastle's northern army during 1643. In the spring of 1643, Newcastle went on the offensive. Despite securing garrisons at Newark and Belvoir, he had seen the Fairfaxes score victories at Leeds and Wakefield, where the Royalist garrisons had been overrun. Now, aided by Lord Goring, who had accompanied Queen Henrietta on her journey back from Holland, Newcastle sought to secure the north for the crown. In March, Goring won a victory at Seacroft Moor, near Leeds, although the victory was more moral than strategic, as it left the larger Parliamentary army stationed nearby intact. Wakefield was reoccupied briefly by the Royalists, but a determined counterattack by Fairfax regained the garrison for Parliament. Among the 1,400 prisoners taken during the fight was Lord Goring himself, and his was a sad loss to Newcastle. In June 1643 came a central moment in the early struggle for the north. The two armies finally met face to face at Adwalton Moor, where Newcastle had gathered 10,000 troops in favourable ground to the south of the village of Adwalton itself. Fearful that Bradford was about to be attacked, the Fairfaxes had little option but to meet the threat, although their army was filled with raw recruits. The result was, perhaps, inevitable.
The Battle of Adwalton Moor was a major Royalist victory and a setback for Fairfax father and son. The battle was fought on open rolling ground, and it was a messy, difficult battle. On high ground, Lord Fairfax was repulsed by a Royalist cavalry charge and had to fall back towards Bradford. His son on lower ground became detached from him. Maybe he didn't realise that his father was falling back. And so he then was badly mauled and had to mount a very difficult and circuitous retreat, initially to Bradford, though they couldn't stay there and they had to fall back further.
The Fairfaxes made their way around Newcastle's force with a small number of men and got into Hull, safe from Newcastle's eventual assault, and putting themselves into a position which they could capitalise on for the future. But the net result of Adwalton Moor, Yorkshire and the north east is in Newcastle's hands for the king.
After the victory at Adwalton came news of trouble for the Royalists in Lincolnshire. The Parliamentarians had inflicted defeat on their armies at the Battle of Gainsborough and had occupied the strategically important town. Sir Charles Cavendish, cousin of the Earl of Newcastle, had been killed as he commanded the Royalist horse against a man whom would later play a vital role in Parliament's overall victory, Colonel Oliver Cromwell. Newcastle's army arrived not only to recapture Gainsborough, but nearby Lincoln too, forcing Cromwell to retreat to Peterborough. The Earl now faced a difficult decision. With 15,000 men at his disposal, he could march on to join with the King's army in the Thames Valley and make a great assault on London. To do this, though, would leave the Fairfaxes at Hull with an army large enough to make trouble for the Royalists in Yorkshire. And so Newcastle made his decision. He would turn, take his army to Hull and lay siege to the town. It would prove to be a costly error.
Many historians criticise the Marquess of Newcastle for not marching south to join the main Royalist armies in the Midlands and the south. Instead, he halted and mounted what turned out to be a futile and unsuccessful siege of Kingston upon Hull. We can criticise him. The siege of Hull was going to be enormously difficult because of its position, because it was defended by low-lying land and water defences, because Parliament had the Navy and Hull could always be supplied, relieved, reinforced by water. It meant that from the outset it was going to be enormously difficult for Newcastle to capture the Kingston upon Hull and take it.
Newcastle was wisest to go to capture Hull. That he failed to capture Hull is unfortunate, but he was wise to try initially. Hull was the second largest armoury in the country, so Hull was a crucial prize for the Royalist Party. It would have saved on long and expensive resupply expeditions from the Netherlands. As a port, it would have allowed those munitions that were coming in from the Netherlands to come in more easily without having to negotiate the English Channel or go around the north of Scotland to get to the friendly port of Bristol.
Because of Parliament's command of the Navy, the potential for landing more troops in Hull and making it a major base for land activity and disrupting Newcastle's lines of communication had he pushed much further south into Lincolnshire and into the parliamentary heartlands of East Anglia and the East Midlands were considerable. Those dangers were considerable. And so his decision to halt and try, albeit vainly, to capture Hull is, I think, explicable.
By the end of 1643, the whole of England was paying a terrible price for the continuation of an increasingly bitter civil war. Although there was undoubtedly a wish on both sides to come to a negotiated peace settlement, King Charles' stubbornness and the political skills of the hawks in the parliamentary camp combined to render such a thing impossible. Robert Bailey, a Scottish commissioner to London, wrote in a letter home in November 1643,
That country is in a most pitiful condition, no corner of it free from the evils of a cruel war. Every shire, every city, many families divided in this quarrel. Much blood and universal spoil made by both where they prevail.
This, then, was the once peaceful and prosperous England as it contemplated another year of conflict and bloodshed.
By the end of 1643, there were several signs that Parliament was losing the war, that the king was winning the war. The Royalists had gained considerable territory during the year. They'd mopped up Yorkshire, they'd rolled through much of Lincolnshire, they'd acquired much territory in the West Midlands, and perhaps most dramatically of all, out of Cornwall they'd broken out and they'd mopped up almost the whole of the southwest and central southern England. By the end of 1643, the Royalists controlled perhaps 2/3 of the land mass of England and Wales, and with it all the resources of men, money, material that implied. The parliamentarians were losing the war, and politically that added to difficulties and uncertainties within Parliament in London.
There was considerable division that if anything grew rather than diminished, as to the purpose of the conflict and the extent to which it should be pressed home. And there were generals and politicians who would have liked a settlement with the king short of victory. After all, most of these generals were as frightened by the idea of winning as they were by the idea of defeat. And that is certainly true of figures of generals such as Essex or Manchester and the leading commanders, in other words, in the early stages of the war for the parliamentary side.
On the 8th of December 1643, Parliament suffered a grievous loss away from the battlefield. John Pym, Parliament's politician supreme, died as a result of an internal abscess. With his passing, those who opposed the king had lost their greatest political visionary and most able administrator. Almost his last political act, however, had been to provide the legislative machinery that would turn the war in favour of Parliament. He had negotiated the Solemn League and Covenant with the Scots.
The death of John Pym in 1643 was a major blow to Parliament's ambitions and plans for the war. He had been, more than anybody else, the driving force behind the parliamentarian command. However, his negotiations with the Scots and the subsequent alliance with the Scots were even more so important. It wasn't just the fact that the Scots were bringing an army of 20,000 men, a disciplined, regularly trained army led by officers who'd got experience on the continent under Gustav Adolf, but it led to the formation of a thing called the Committee for Both Kingdoms, a 25-man committee that was made up mainly of MPs, but also of members from the army and from Scotland. And this in itself is a crucial event, in that it's the start of an identity of Parliament, not as a body led by one man, but as a body led by the body.
With the agreement of the Solemn League and Covenant, the whole complexion of the war was altered, for it bound the Scots to provide an army on the parliamentary side. The Act also committed both countries to a common act of worship, which the Scots carelessly assumed would be Presbyterianism. The English, however, added the telling phrase, "according to the word of God," to the agreement, thus making it a good deal more ambiguous. The misunderstanding over the form of worship would eventually lead to the breakup of the alliance, but, for the time being, Parliament had exactly what it needed: military help from a strong outside power.
Now, these Scottish troops were incredibly important. It's not just a matter of numbers. The Scots were also, in many senses, militarily more effective than their English counterparts, because a large number of Scottish troops and even more of their officers had served on the continent in the long-standing 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648 and had gained military experience as a result. Furthermore, the Scots were willing to campaign not just at the edges of England, not just to take, shall we say, Berwick or Newcastle, but to go a long way south, not just to Yorkshire. In fact, Scottish troops got as far south as Herefordshire.
These pro-parliamentarian Scots have a dramatic impact on the war in 1644. The Royalists in the north of England are now effectively sandwiched between English parliamentarians to the south, Scottish parliamentarians to the north, and they are the meat in the sandwich, and in 1644 they suffer and they break.
On the 19th of January 1644, the blue-bonneted Scots were led across the River Tweed by Alexander Leslie, the Earl of Leven, the army's able and experienced commander. Suddenly, the king's cause in the north was under real threat. He could ill afford to lose an area so fertile for new recruits, or his access to the supplies of coal that were being shipped out from the Tyne to pay for arms and ammunition. In response to this new danger, the Earl of Newcastle raced northwards in an attempt to hold the line of the River Tyne against the invading Scots army. But he quickly received dire news. Taking advantage of Newcastle's absence from Yorkshire, the Fairfaxes had stormed the market town of Selby and destroyed the Royalist field army left by Newcastle to protect the city of York. The Royalist capital of the north was in grave danger of falling into the hands of Parliamentary forces. Abandoning all hope of halting the Scots' advance, Newcastle turned and hurried southwards to save York. It was now that the 64-year-old Earl of Leven revealed a boldness hitherto lacking in his Royalist counterparts. When it might have been prudent to stay in the far north to secure his lines of supply, the Earl took a calculated risk and headed south towards York in hot pursuit of Newcastle's army. By the 22nd of April, he had joined up with Fairfax's army outside York, and Newcastle's force was promptly besieged within the city's ancient walls. Relief of the city was absolutely vital for the Royalist cause. Sooner or later, York would be starved into submission. If it should fall, it would be the end for the king in the north, and perhaps the country as a whole.
Charles I is determined to hang on to York. It's his northern capital. It's a key centre. It would be terrible in terms of resources, morale, for him to lose it. He's determined to hold on to it if at all possible. He hasn't got a northern army that he can spare and send to the relief of York. Instead, he has to try and get one of his southern armies, but he can't spare his main army, so he authorises his nephew, Prince Rupert, to lead an army north, a long march through the West Midlands, the northwest, to march up and relieve York. The additional problem is that he can't spare many men from his southern army, given campaigns there in the south and the Midlands, for Rupert to take. So Rupert initially has to set off with relatively modest sized force, and he has to try and pick up further men en route.
Meanwhile, back at Oxford, the war was going very badly indeed for the king. Unable to make any headway against the two parliamentarian armies commanded by the Earl of Essex and Sir William Waller, Charles made the desperate decision to concentrate the Royalist forces at the loyal town of Worcester. He wrote to Rupert in an attempt to recall the prince's forces for that rendezvous. But the letter was couched in such ambiguous terms that it was actually to precipitate the battle that spelt the beginning of the end for Charles. The letter read,
"If York be lost, I shall esteem my crown little less, unless supported by your sudden march to me and a miraculous conquest in the south, before the effects of their northern power can be found here. But if York be relieved, and you beat the rebel army of both kingdoms which are before it, then, but otherwise not, I may possibly make a shift upon the defensive to spin out time until you come to assist me. But if that be either lost, or have freed themselves from besiegers, or that for want of powder you cannot undertake that work, that you immediately march with your whole strength directly to Worcester to assist me and my army. Without which, or your having relieved York by beating the Scots, all the successes you have afterwards must infallibly be useless to me."
The king's letter was an object lesson in lack of clarity, but the central theme was clear enough. He was in serious trouble, and he urgently required the assistance of Prince Rupert and his army. If Rupert was able to relieve York by beating the Scots, then that was well and good. But come what may, he must march south again as soon as possible to meet the king at Worcester. Rupert received the fateful letter 5 days after it was sent, by which time the prospects for the Royalist garrison at York looked bleak indeed. For although they were still well stocked with food and ammunition, the two besieging armies had now been joined by a third under the command of the Earl of Manchester. Rupert weighed up his options. If he marched south to join the king, York would certainly be lost. On the other hand, the king's letter had hinted at a few days' grace. It did not take long for the prince to reach a decision or to display the single-minded determination that was so typical of him. He would march to relieve York before joining his uncle at Worcester. The problem was, of course, that the Parliamentarian armies at York outnumbered Rupert's own by 2-1. He had triumphed over such odds before, but this time, with so much at stake, the prince knew that he would have to considerably reduce the odds before risking a pitched battle. Rupert's solution was bold and imaginative.
Prince Rupert's plan to relieve York was based on two assumptions. The first assumption would be that he would be outnumbered by the Allied army, at least 2-1, and the second assumption would be that he wouldn't be able to offer battle until he'd linked up with the Marquis of Newcastle's army. He had three options. The first option was to advance from Naseby straight towards York, but the Allied army was camped at Long Marston. The second option was a more indirect route via Wetherby, but still he would have this problem with the Allied army at Long Marston again. The third option, and the one that he chose, was an indirect route through Boroughbridge and Thornton Bridge and into York that way.
Part of his army is feinted away to try and dislodge the Parliamentary army, to march them in the wrong direction, while the bulk of his army, in a rather circuitous march, is able to bypass the English and Scottish Parliamentary forces, and thus, undisruptive and without having to give battle, the bulk of his army is able to swing round and enter York.
Rupert entered the city of York in triumph on July the 1st, 1644, to the great joy of its weary defenders. There was now a combined army of 6,000 cavalrymen and 11,000 infantrymen inside York, enough, Rupert believed, to take on the allied Parliamentarian armies outside. However, Newcastle's exhausted men were far from keen to do battle. The long siege had sapped their fighting spirit. What was more, Lord Eithin, Newcastle's Scottish Chief of Staff, made plain his discomfort at the prospect of a battle with his own countrymen. Fighting English parliamentarians was one thing, he told Rupert, but fighting Scotsmen was quite another. The dispirited parliamentarian armies soon abandoned any hope of laying further siege to York and moved off in the direction of Tadcaster. The Earl of Newcastle and Lord Eithin pleaded with Rupert to give the Royalist army time to rest, but the prince argued that if they could beat the Scots, the threat to York would be removed for good. There was also, of course, the matter of the king's letter, urging Rupert to come to his aid as soon as possible. There was no alternative, argued Rupert. The Royalist army must fight, and fight now. Reluctantly, Newcastle and Eithin acceded to the prince's wishes. What Prince Rupert could not know was that only 3 days earlier the king's forces had met and defeated the army of Sir William Waller at Croppedy Bridge in Oxfordshire.
Against all expectations, Charles was moving north away from Oxford and found himself on the opposite side of the Cherwell from Sir William Waller's army. His scouts reported that Waller had extended himself, and in an action which encompassed all 3 bridges, the king, against all expectations, was able to rout and defeat Waller's army. And this really was one of the things that had bothered him, this army that was shadowing him. And in actual fact, by doing this, he very nearly removed the need for the action at Marston Moor. Unfortunately, they were not able to communicate this to Rupert and Newcastle in time.
The course of the war had changed significantly, but everything Rupert now planned and carried out had the relief of his uncle's army at Worcester as his primary objective. Driven on still by the urgent tone of the king's letter, his army set off as quickly as it could in pursuit of the parliamentarian forces. It was not long before he caught up with their rearguard on a Yorkshire moor on the afternoon of the 1st of July, 1644. The Battle of Marston Moor, the decisive battle of the English Civil War, was now only hours away. On a freezing January day in 1649, the executioner's axe ended the reign and the life of King Charles I. It was the final melancholy episode in one of England's saddest stories. Sent to his death by a parliament weary of his duplicity, the king met his end with dignity and courage. Behind him, he left a kingdom still scarred and divided by the English civil wars. During the early years of the 17th century, the quiet shires and peaceful towns of England enjoyed a long period of peace that was finally shattered by the unparalleled conflict that burst fully into life during 1642. That unhappy time has become known as the English Civil Wars, even though the tumultuous events also involved Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. Ultimately, no corner of the British Isles was left untouched by a bloody and tragic war that set brother against brother and father against son. In a letter to his brother, Ralph, the MP Edmund Verney wrote,
"Brother, what I feared is proved to be true, which is your being against the king. Give me leave to tell you, in my opinion, 'tis most unhandsomely done, and it grieves my heart to think that my father already, and I, who so dearly esteem you, should be bound to be your enemy. I hear 'tis a great grief to my father."
The English Civil War was in many senses the most traumatic set of events in English history. It led not only to large numbers of people being killed, because that has happened elsewhere in English history, one can think of the First World War, but crucially to large numbers of people being killed by their neighbours, by their members of their extended family, by other people who were from the same country.
James Spencer, a reluctant Royalist soldier, wrote to his wife in September 1641,
"The discontent that I and many other honest men receive daily is beyond expression. People are much divided, and the king is of late very averse to peace. This is lightning before death."
The origins of the English Civil War are complex, and a host of historical interpretations, not all free from vested interests, have failed to establish a single clear-cut cause. The events of nearly 400 years ago are even more obscured not just by the passing of time, but by the activities of propagandists on both sides, even up to the present day.
Marks the service of those whose membership dates from the early days of the King's Army.
The causes of the war that set Englishmen against Englishmen stemmed from a process of evolution, a process that some have seen as the transformation of the Church and Constitution from a medieval society into a modern nation-state.
There is a lot of debate about the root causes of the English Civil War. Some will have it as a religious conflict, some people will have it as a political conflict. Some people even class it as a class conflict. It's difficult to say that those are actually the root causes. The root causes are probably more likely the demographics of the English population.
Roughly a doubling of the English and Welsh population caused all sorts of problems: unemployment, poverty. Some social groups did relatively badly in that period. Some of the masses with poverty. Also at the other end of the social scale, the elite, the aristocracy. Some historians suggest that they were struggling a little bit, 1540 to 1640. Conversely, other social groups, such as the rural gentry, such as the urban mercantile communities, probably getting stronger.
The accelerating pace of progress during the long peace of the 16th and 17th centuries had imposed intolerable strains on the feudal structures by which the people of England were governed. In the fields of art, science, theology and commerce, old boundaries were constantly being pushed back, and the process of Renaissance, a cultural and scientific rebirth, that had dragged Europe out of the Middle Ages was, by now, almost complete. England was, despite the tensions, a peaceful and prosperous nation at last. Continual advances in trade and industry were creating an increasingly sophisticated society that many believed needed new, more modern forms of government. As the merchant class expanded, so the demands for a voice in its own affairs grew louder. It also began to explore new forms of religious worship. Among those who sought change, however, the precise nature of what the new society needed had yet to be fully defined. Throughout the nation, there was a heated debate on matters of government, commerce, and religion that eventually came to form two distinct parties. For some Englishmen, constitutional change was the goal. For others, greater freedom of trade was the burning issue of the day. For those who were most determined to fashion change, however, it was religious reform that mattered most, and it was this issue that lay at the root of the divisions in English society during the late 1630s and early 1640s.
England and Wales went through a reformation in the 16th century, as a result of which they broke from Rome and became Protestantised. There's a minority who remain Roman Catholic, but by the 17th century they're a very small minority. They're not really a political problem, they don't cause trouble. The real issue is, where's the Church of England as a Protestant church going to go? How far down the lines of Protestantism is it to progress? And there's a tension in the Elizabethan and Jacobean periods between those who want to push the Reformation further, who want to do away with some of the Catholic hangovers in terms of the trinkets, the ceremonials, in terms of the structure of the church, and push it further along a Protestant, what we might call low church line. And there are those who say, no, we've gone far enough, it's a perfectly good, part Catholic, but essentially Protestant compromise.
Religion was important, certainly in helping to account for those people who were particularly partisan, particularly active. And in any civil war, it's the activists that tend to be most important, certainly in the early stages. There is no doubt that those who were puritanically disposed were inclined to be parliamentarian, and those who were crypto-Catholics were inclined to be royalists.
Because of the deep suspicion of the court and its possible Catholic sympathies, the parliamentary side enjoyed far greater popular support among ordinary folk. A proportion, however, clung to their traditional loyalties to the crown and were unrepresented in Parliament. The Royalist cause was better represented among the gentry and landowning aristocracy, many of whom owed their position and privileges to the Stuarts. It was, nevertheless, some members from these sections of the population that were most vocal in their opposition to their government. There was, therefore, no clear class division, but the entire nation was at odds. The country was splitting apart.
Across the country, it is possible to always find supporters of both sides. For example, there were parliamentarians in Cornwall, which was overwhelmingly a Royalist county. There were Royalists in Norfolk, which was overwhelmingly a parliamentary county. Also, among every single occupational group, one can find people on both sides. You can find aristocrats on both sides. You can find progressive landlords interested in new agricultural methods on both sides, and conservative landlords on both sides.
However heartfelt the causes on both sides, one thing was sure. Any move towards reform would inevitably mean a collision with King Charles I. Charles' father, James VI of Scotland, had ascended the throne of England left vacant by the childless Elizabeth I in 1603, and had so become both James VI of Scotland and James I of England. When he succeeded his father, Charles was therefore only the second king to rule both kingdoms of Scotland and England, which were still separate countries in every legal and economic sense.
From 1603, the King of England and Wales ruled not only those countries, but also Ireland and also Scotland. And so we've got what some historians refer to as the British problem, the problem of multiple kingdoms. A single person, a king, trying to rule three very different, disparate nations with different social structures, different laws, different religion and so on. And all those create long-term pressures and tensions within the English and British state in the decades before the English Civil War broke out.
King Charles was a man of great principle and conviction, but he was a man totally opposed to the kind of change advocated by large sections of his people.
Charles's role of king is often summed up in the terms divine right, and this is often taken to mean an absolutist monarch whose word is law, with no consideration for his country. But in actual fact, this doesn't cover it very well, because Charles himself was very aware that as king by divine right of God, he was responsible for the country. He saw himself as the shepherd of the country. On the other hand, Charles saw that anybody who hindered him in his performance of that role, who didn't cooperate with him fully, was working against the country. And this is one of the reasons why he had the conflict with Parliament, in that Parliament saw that their role in the governing of the country was more important perhaps than the king's, hence the conflict.
Charles distrusted parliaments absolutely, and had governed the country for long periods without recourse to one. A revealing insight into his opinion of them came in an address to the Lords and the Commons in 1626. Its arrogance set the tone for his dealings with the people's representatives for the rest of his life.
Remember that parliaments are altogether in my own power for their calling, sitting, and dissolution. Therefore, as I find the fruits of them good or evil, they are to continue or not to be. And remember that if you persist in your errors, you make them greater and irreconcilable. Whereas if you do go on cheerfully to mend them, you will do yourselves honour and shall encourage me to go on with parliaments.
Charles I's problems with Parliament, in particular their unwillingness to finance his policies, their uncertainty about his autocratic attitudes, and their unhappiness with his clerical politics, led in 1629 to the king to decide to rule without Parliament, the so-called personal rule, which lasted from 1629 to 1640. Now, to rule without Parliament was not illegal, but what it in many senses encapsulated was a determination on the king's part to follow his own views and not in any way to heed advice or to accept compromise.
Charles' failure to call a parliament meant that there was no effective platform for national debate, and, consequently, the simmering unrest that continued to ferment beneath the surface of English society had no real outlet. This was to have disastrous consequences for Charles when he was eventually forced by events to recall Parliament. With his inflexible views on kingship and his equally intransigent stance on the central role of the Church of England, the king and his supporters represented a common obstacle to change in all of the main areas in which many of his subjects demanded reform. Inevitably, they were soon being seen as the enemy. In the 17th century, there was still a great deal of reverence for the position of the sovereign, and even his severest opponents stopped short of hostility towards the king himself. Their enmity was reserved not for the king, but for his evil counsellors. Chief among these was Charles' close friend and confidant, Thomas Wentworth, Earl of Strafford.
Having dissolved Parliament, Charles needed people to assist him to run the country, and Thomas Wentworth, who was a Yorkshireman, has been described as forcing his way into government. He was chairman of the Council of the North, he was governor of Ireland, but more importantly, his role fitted nicely with Charles's vision of kingship. Wentworth was able to use his tasks, to use the jobs that Charles set him, to improve his own condition, to increase his own personal wealth and power, but at the same time supply the king with what he needed.
For most of the 1630s, he's not in England and Wales, he's in Ireland, the king's governor in Ireland. And in Ireland, he pushes through quite ruthlessly and tactlessly the sort of policies that Charles was trying to or hoping to push through in England and Wales. We see things like the elevation of royal authority. The king's word is law and must be obeyed. Right at the end of the 1630s, as one of the key confidants of Charles I, he is recalled to England and Wales. He is raised to the peerage as the Earl of Strafford, and he is there to put bite into the king, to give him backbone. He does support the recalling of Parliament in the late 1630s, but it's a Parliament that should do the king's bidding. And with the army that he had built up and raised in Ireland in the late 1630s, he offers Charles an alternative route forward, possibly using this Irish army to back up his own position in England and Wales.
Eventually, the various groups seeking to change English society formed into a single party that was directly opposed to the Royalists. These zealous groups became generally known as Puritans.
Puritanism was derived from a belief that the Protestant Reformation had not gone far enough. The Anglican Church, the Arminian Church, saw itself as the logical successor to the Reformation. But the growing belief on the continent, and it was a belief that was brought into England by various scholars, was this Reformation had not gone far enough.
They see or they believe that the Church of England, their faith, is under great threat, that things are moving backwards in a Catholic direction, and they are increasingly worried about where it's going. And it's no coincidence that in the 1640s, as the political situation broke down, it's many of this Puritan group, Puritan clique, Puritan party, whatever we call it, who come to the fore early on in the Parliamentary cause as the leader of that cause, the most outspoken critics of Charles's religious and broader political and constitutional policies.
Charles himself certainly wished to see not simply moves against any inclination towards Puritanism, but also wanted to see a tightening of aspects of church doctrine, church liturgy, church ceremonial, all of which offended a large number of people.
An already difficult situation was not helped when it was learned that the Catholic Henrietta Maria, the king's French wife, was being allowed to maintain her own private priests. Low profile though this private arrangement was, it attracted harsh criticism. As Catholicism was held in such deep suspicion, the fact that the Queen of England was herself a Catholic was a source of considerable unease for the more extreme factions of the population who saw a papist plot lurking in every corner. There was also the constant fear that Charles himself might be converted to the Catholic faith.
Charles's attitudes, his fascination with many respects of ritual, his fascination with many aspects of Catholic culture, made him in many senses very amenable to the idea of Catholicism.
Although religion was the major factor in the escalation of national unrest, it was economic issues arising from the religious discontent that would finally light the fuse and plunge the country into civil war. Not content with imposing a new, rigid form of worship on the Church of England, Charles sought to extend his reforms to the Church of Scotland. In doing so, he committed a fatal error. Charles attempted to impose a new Anglican Book of Common Prayer, written by the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, on the Presbyterian Church of Scotland.
Laud looked at Scotland and saw that the Scottish system, which was a Presbyterian system, where each church was a separate committee within the structure with no bishops, and they sought to impose the English order on the Scottish Church. Consequently, they imposed a new prayer book, which denied the Scottish one of their two forms of communion, their choice. Naturally, there was a riot.
Scotland was united in its outrage, and a national covenant in defence of its own fiercely Protestant religion was signed. This led the country into open conflict with the king, for the covenant bound every able-bodied man and woman with a vow to protect their religious liberties. Ominously for King Charles, the Scots set about raising an army of the covenant. In two short wars during 1639 and 1640, Charles's armies were defeated and humiliated by the Scots Covenanters in two almost farcical conflicts, which are remembered as the Bishops' Wars. Charles' father, James I, employing great skills, had managed to achieve the seemingly impossible. He had successfully reintroduced bishops into the Scottish Presbyterian system. Charles, with his high-handed attitude, managed to undo all of his father's achievements, as the Scots threw out the bishops and took up arms against him. The outcome of these two short and relatively bloodless wars proved to be an unmitigated military disaster for King Charles. The Scots army easily defeated the hastily assembled English forces thrown against them at the Battle of Newbury, before marching on to occupy Newcastle. Charles was now virtually bankrupt. He certainly had insufficient funds to pay his army, who reacted by deserting in droves. So it was that, for the first time in 1,000 years of cross-border warfare, the city of Newcastle upon Tyne fell into Scottish hands, and it was they who dictated surrender terms to the king.
The crisis known as the Bishops' War forced Charles to address the issue of how he was to fund the British state. After all, if his authority in the British state was to rest fundamentally on the power of England, including hopefully the ability of England to coerce Scotland, then he would have to finance a larger army, because the English army in the 1630s was small. Had Charles beat the Scots, then this crisis might not have arisen, or it might have been a short-term crisis. But what one sees at the end of the 1630s and in 1640 is the combination of a military crisis, the failure to coerce the Scots, and indeed the successful Scottish invasion of northern England, and a political crisis.
With the hostile Scots army before him and an increasingly unruly Parliament at his back, Charles recognised that, for the moment at least, he could not bend Scotland to his will by force. With the pig-headedness that was to typify Charles' rule, he performed an amazing about-turn and travelled to Edinburgh in a forlorn attempt to court Scots' assistance. Charles realised that he was now on the verge of a war with his own Parliament, and that he needed to neutralise and pacify the Scots in order that he could deal with his English problems undistracted. The king's attempt to win over his erstwhile enemies in Scotland was to prove futile. His visit to Scotland was a complete failure, as the Scots, not surprisingly, made it clear that they could hardly support the same monarch who had so recently attempted to deprive them of their religious liberties. For the time being, however, they agreed that they would not oppose Charles either. But when the war in England eventually came, the Scots were to stand menacingly on the sidelines waiting to see the outcome. Militarily, the Bishops' War had been a shambles, but worse still for Charles was the financial cost of waging war. For 11 years he had ruled the country without recourse to Parliament, a period frequently referred to by his opponents as the 11-year tyranny. He was now about to pay the price for his autocratic stewardship of the country, for during those 11 years he had had to raise money to govern the country by twisting and manipulating taxation laws, as well as taking full advantage of the sovereign's right to grant monopolies. The king's financial management of the country created huge unrest among the merchant class, who objected strongly to royal monopolies being granted on, among many other things, the manufacture of soap and salt. Furthermore, the reintroduction and extension of dormant taxes like ship money further fanned the flames of revolt. Of all the measures put into place by Charles to raise funds, ship money is probably the most infamous. The tax was supposed to be levied in time of war on coastal counties only, in order to pay for the naval defences of the country. But in 1636, Charles ruled that it should be collected nationwide and made ship money a regular tax. There was little opposition to the measure at first, but gradually discontent grew until in 1637 John Hampden, a wealthy landowner and member of Parliament from Buckinghamshire, went to the High Court to bring what became a test case for the tax. A majority of the High Court judges ruled in favour of the king's right to levy the tax, but the margin was very small, and most people viewed the result as a moral victory for those opposed to collection of ship money. Although it was not as a direct result of the Hampden case, within 2 years the tax had become virtually impossible to administer, and funds had all but ceased to find their way to the Treasury. Charles may have asked himself if it was all worth the trouble, for the revenues these highly unpopular measures raised proved insufficient even to keep the king's coffers in order, far less finance a war.
It was tradition that a parliament should be called before or on going to war. An exception in 1639, Charles I had gone to war against the Scots, the first Scots or Bishops' War, without calling an English parliament. He tried to raise money elsewhere. That war had gone disastrously wrong and left him hugely in debt. Nothing daunted, Charles I was looking to go to war against the Scots again in 1640, but this time it was fairly clear to him or to his chief advisers, such as the Earl of Strafford, that he really had to call Parliament to get their support and get money. And that's why in spring 1640, for the first time in 11 years, Charles I calls a Parliament in England and Wales, the Parliament that becomes known as the Short Parliament. Far from granting him quick, ready money for the Scottish War, it has its own shopping list of criticisms and grievances, religious, political, constitutional, built up over the previous 11 years, which it wants addressed first.
In a fury, Charles dismissed them in May 1640. But, after the failure of the Second Bishops' War, he was soon forced to call another, the so-called Long Parliament of November 1640. This was even more hostile in its demands. Skillfully marshalled by the arch-politician John Pym, Parliament introduced legislation that made dissolution impossible until its grievance had been dealt with.
Under Pym's leadership, they pushed through a range of political constitutional reforms. They ensure that the present Parliament, the Long Parliament, can't be dissolved without its own consent. They ensure that henceforward under Triennial Act, no more than 3 years should elapse between the dissolution of one Parliament and the summoning of the next Parliament. They remove most of the non-parliamentary financial measures that Charles had relied upon during the personal rule. So things like ship money are declared illegal. They also removed most of the key prerogative courts, the King's courts that he'd used to push through his government in the 1630s, things like the Court of High Commission, the Court of Star Chamber.
The people that met did not think that there was going to be a revolution. What they wanted was reform. What they wanted was a monarch who would listen to them, who would remove unpopular ministers, and who would in some way engage in a new partnership.
The establishment of the Long Parliament proved a vital blow to the king's fortunes, for his opponents sensed their opportunity and had no intention of letting it slip. Parliament had in its sights the king's closest advisers, particularly the Earl of Strafford and the Archbishop of Canterbury. Strafford was impeached and sent to the Tower of London only a few days after Parliament convened. Early in December 1640, Archbishop Laud joined him there. Deprived of his closest allies and most trusted advisers, King Charles was lost. It was now that he began to fall increasingly under the influence of Henrietta Maria, who offered her husband sincere but ill-informed advice. Of course he could and should re-establish royal absolutism, she insisted. He should make no concessions to Parliament, she counselled. Sadly for the king, his wife had no concept of the depth of feeling among the English gentry against her husband or his position. If the vast majority had no wish for a republic, they were certainly determined to have a king who operated within the constraints of a constitutional monarchy. In February 1641, Charles, with great reluctance and ill grace, assented to the Triennial Act that stated that a new Parliament must be called no more than 3 years after the dissolution of the previous Parliament. Now, the king was forced to look on as the trial of his great friend Strafford for treason began on 22nd March in Westminster Hall. As Charles watched the impeachment proceedings from his royal box, surely one thing was furthest from his mind, that less than 8 years later, he too would one day stand on trial for his life in that very same place.
It was very important that Parliament could not attack the institution of the king himself. So they sought to chip away his position by attacking the people that supported him, in particular Wentworth and Laud. The Earl of Strafford, Thomas Wentworth, was a very clever, astute man, and he managed to actually almost evade the case, the legal case put to him against him by Parliament. However, Parliament still had one trick up the sleeve, the Bill of Attainder. It's been described as legalised murder.
The problem with a bill, a piece of legislation, is that it needs the King's assent before it can have any effect. So landing on the King's desk is this bill. It's passed the House of Commons and the House of Lords. He agonises, he tries to negotiate with Parliament for some sort of a punishment less than death, banishment, exile, whatever. He tries to get his eldest son, the Prince of Wales, to plead on Strafford's behalf. Pym and Parliament has nothing to do with that. No, only the full Act of Attainder, complete with the death sentence, will do. And eventually, with Parliament baying for justice and with increasing disorder in London crowds coming out, pushing for the Act of Attainder, pushing for execution, Charles gives way and he does sign that Act. The Act is then put into effect.
The doomed Earl wrote in May 1641,
"Put not your trust in princes."
In November 1641, Parliament presented King Charles with the Grand Remonstrance, a list of 201 objections to his governmental methods.
The Great Remonstrance was actually fuelled by the fact that Parliament needed to make a major effort. The treaty with the Scots that Charles signed, in many people's eyes, was a sellout of English religion. And they could see that the king had been forced into this by Parliament. So people that had previously supported Parliament were angry, and Parliament needed to take a step that would show that they were back in control of the situation.
The Grand Remonstrance is debated in a rather thin House of Commons. It eventually passes by a thin majority, just by 11 votes. And in the debate on the Grand Remonstrance, on the divisions in the House of Commons that the Grand Remonstrance reveals, we can begin to see two parties. The King is now gaining a political party, constitutional Royalists, who perhaps will rally to him and give him a party if it moves from a political sphere to a military sphere. Against him there are those die-hard reformists who will carry on and push through and become the basis of the Parliamentary party in the Civil War.
Events were now moving quickly. With each passing day, the position of the two sides became more entrenched, and the likelihood of a peaceful resolution to the country's problems became ever more remote. Now came news of a further development that would speed the country towards outright civil war. In 1641, Ireland exploded into rebellion.
The cause of the rebellion in Ireland was the constant movement of English Protestants into Ulster. This was seen as not so much a religious venture as more a financial venture by many English entrepreneurs, some of whom were Puritans as well. Now, set against this and the creation of a two-tier society in Ireland, you have a growing development of links between Dublin and England. The Irish Catholics start to fear an imposition on them of the English religion. They're worried about their Catholicism in the way that the English worried about their Protestantism. Consequently, you get this explosion. Dungannon, Montclair and Newbury all rebel. There is murder, there's raping, there's burning and pillage.
This meant that an army would have to be formed to try and restore order or a semblance of control in Ireland. And this again proved a crucial issue in 1641. Who would control the army? Could the king be trusted to control it? Could he be trusted not to use it against opponents in England? Well, most of these opponents did not think so. Equally, from the king's point of view, it was unacceptable to have a royal army in which he had no power. So the issues of control of the army and the settlement of the church proved the crucial precipitants of a crisis within a context of a general lack of trust.
The pace of events quickened further when, in January 1642, King Charles, encouraged by Henrietta Maria, attempted to impeach and arrest 5 leading members of the opposition. They were Pym, Hampden, Hazelrig, Hollis and Strode. The attempted arrest was a tragic farce. The 5 members had long since escaped by boat. For the first time, a reigning monarch entered the House of Commons only to find himself humiliated.
Well, I see the birds have flown. I do expect from you that you shall return unto me as soon as they are returned hither. If not, I shall seek them myself, for their treason is foul, and such a one as you shall thank me to discover. But I assure you, on the word of a king, I never did intend any force, but shall proceed against them in a legal and fair way, for I never meant any other.
It soon became obvious to the king and his followers that the 5 members would never be arrested, and that the force of militia gathering in London in support of Parliament was more than capable of overpowering the Royal Guard. Faced now with the outright hostility of the people of London and fearful for the safety of Henrietta Maria, the king and his family fled from the capital on the 10th of January, the very day that Pym and his fellow members of Parliament made a triumphant return to Westminster.
Charles actually fled from London. He moved initially west to Hampton Court, but then soon after he departed, he moved north, and he ended up in spring 1642 in York, that became his effectively northern rival capital for much of the spring and summer of 1642. It's this geographical separation of the king and his court and his supporters from Parliament, and the continuing critics of the king in Parliament continue to sit in London, that allows a separation of the two parties. They're no longer even talking, they're no longer communicating in a realistic fashion, and it's another step towards civil war.
On St. George's Day 1642, from his new base at York, the king sent out troops in an attempt to seize the city of Hull, wherein lay great stockpiles of arms and ammunition stored for use in the Scottish War. If the king had expected subservience or cooperation, he was sorely disappointed. The governor, Sir John Hotham, refused to open the gates of the city. The point of no return had been reached. By placing military forces under their own control, the opposition lay itself open to charges of treason, should the king ever be in a position to govern once more with unfettered power. Even at this late stage, however, there were still some moves towards conciliation. Parliament sent a request for temporary control of the militia to the king. His reply was unequivocal.
By God, not for an hour. You have asked that of me in this, which was never asked of a king, and with which I will not trust my wife and children.
Over the summer of 1642, there was furious activity about the country. People were organising local Royalist parties, people were organising support for the Parliament side. There was a struggle for control over the local trained band regiments. There was a flurry of pamphlets stating this position, that position. Charles was in York gathering support. The support was very, very slow, and it must have been principally because of the way that people were worrying about their local issues rather than the big picture.
There were attempts at the outset in a number of counties, Cheshire is a good example, an example that has been studied, to actually try and get agreements to keep the war somewhere else. These agreements failed for a simple reason. As in other civil wars, it's the activists, or if you want to use the phrase, the fanatics, who drive the pace and force people to take one side or another.
Neither side experienced overwhelming enthusiasm when they set out in the towns and countries to recruit during summer 1642. But against that, it has to be said, this is this stage of voluntary recruitment. The armies went around, or officers went around, offering regular pay. Because of the level of commitment, because of the level of unemployment perhaps at this time, a significant number of men were willing to sign up and voluntarily go off to fight for king or parliament. By the late summer, early autumn of 1642, both sides had volunteer armies numbering somewhere between perhaps 20, 25, maybe up to 30,000 men.
On the 22nd of August, 1642, all hope of avoiding war disappeared when the king finally raised his standard at Nottingham. The English Civil War, the Great Rebellion, had finally begun. Perhaps it was an omen that the royal standard was blown down by high winds that very night. Desperately short of money, arms and ammunition, the Royalist cause generally enjoyed its greatest support in the west and north of England and Wales, and the king travelled to Shrewsbury to join up with recruits based there. On the 23rd of September, the first action came at Powick Bridge, near Worcester, when Royalist horses commanded by the King's nephew, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, met 10 troops of Parliamentary horse under Colonel John Brown. "2,000 men did battle in what became a confused and farcical skirmish that nonetheless claimed 150 lives. After the battle, Prince Rupert joined his uncle at Shrewsbury, while the Parliamentary forces under the Earl of Essex marched on and occupied Worcester. The two sides would not have to wait long to come to grips again, for the scene was now set for the first great pitched battle of the English Civil War. It would come in October 1642 in the beautiful Warwickshire countryside at Edge Hill. The execution of King Charles in January 1649 was not the final chapter in one of Britain's most tragic stories. If the people of the British Isles imagined a new era of peace and stability, they were to be sorely disappointed. England was now a Commonwealth and not a kingdom, and, amid the rancour and the disagreements, new policies and systems would have to emerge. This bruised and battered country was still forced to contemplate an uncertain future.
People were determined not to kill each other in large numbers, and they were worried about the impact of civil conflict on the rest of society.
Instead, what they want is to secure a civilian form of government that will be friendly towards the army and will fulfil the army's military, religious, political, constitutional ambitions and agenda.
With the king gone, Cromwell at last began to wield real political authority, and he was elected as the first chairman of the new Council of State that was first convened in February 1649.
In the aftermath of a civil war, military reputation continued to be crucial to political power. Oliver Cromwell was a figure who had emerged as a result of his military success in the First English Civil War. He had had a background in the Eastern Association, he had a background as a cavalry officer, he became commander of the cavalry in the New Model Army. For a man from the rather humbler reaches of the Huntingdonshire gentry, he was doing extremely well.
Cromwell had achieved his ambitions through the power of his personality, the force of his fiery oratory, and his undoubted military genius. He had created a unique opportunity to realize his dream of establishing the new Jerusalem in England.
Cromwell's New Jerusalem would be a place where every man could worship in his own way, as long as that worship was genuine and was not pressed on others. It did not, however, include the papists.
There's Cromwell, the conservative country gentleman, the traditionalist, The Cromwell who wants healing and settling, as he says it. He wants to end the civil wars. He wants to restore as much as possible of the traditional civilian forms of government. But against that there's Cromwell the radical, Cromwell the religious visionary, Cromwell the man of God, the Cromwell who believed that it was now payback time.
England may have been pacified, but Ireland and Scotland still played host to many Royalist sympathisers and, more worryingly for Cromwell, Royalist armies. He viewed these threats as more dangerous than any possible return of his English Royalist enemies.
There is more cause of danger from disunion among ourselves than by anything from our enemies. But I had rather be overrun with a Cavalierish interest than a Scotch interest. I'd rather be overrun with a Scotch interest than an Irish interest, and I think of all this is the most dangerous. Now that should awaken all Englishmen.
Effectively, the Irish rebellion of 1641 has never really been put down, and that's why within a few months of the trial and execution and the establishment of the Republic, Cromwell is authorised to command a large part of the new model army to restore English Protestant control over Ireland.
Appointed Lord General of the Parliamentary forces in Ireland in March 1649, he set about the task of subduing the rebellious Irish forces with his usual vigour and confident expectations of victory. This phase of Cromwell's life was to bring him lasting infamy in so many parts of Ireland and the British Isles. On the 4th of September 1649, Cromwell's fearsome new model army made an assault on the Royalist-held town of Drogheda.
From his landing place in Ireland, Drogheda represented the next logical step. The town of Drogheda and the fortress of Drogheda marked the centre of Royalist resistance within Ireland, and it also blocked his road north.
Two huge assaults by Cromwell's army were thrown back before a third, led by Cromwell in person, succeeded in breaking into the town. Cromwell's own words show that he was in no mood to compromise, negotiate, or show mercy.
The enemy retreated, diverse of them, into the Mill Mount, a place very strong and of difficult access, being exceedingly high, having a good graft, and strongly palisaded. The governor, Sir Arthur Aston, and divers considerable officers being there, our men, getting up to them, were ordered by me to put them all to the sword. And indeed, being in the heat of action, I forbade them to spare any that were in arms in the town, and I think that night they put to sword about 2,000 men. These atrocities, they were done in the heat of action. But the slaughter will tend to prevent the effusion of blood for the future, which are the only satisfactory grounds to such actions, which otherwise cannot but work remorse and regret.
Oliver Cromwell's campaign in Ireland in 1649 has become notorious in Irish history. It's regarded as a clear sign of the cruelty of the English. It's important to put this in context. In neither Drogheda or Wexford were women or children killed. And although the garrison at Drogheda was slaughtered, about 2,500 men being killed, and the few who weren't slaughtered were sent off to the West Indies, the laws of war at that stage allowed for the slaughter of people when garrisons were stormed. Furthermore, the actual nature of warfare in Ireland had been bloody throughout the 1640s, and the rebels in 1641 had slaughtered a fair number of people themselves.
But nonetheless, it remains a blot on Cromwell's military record. It is out of kilter with his usual way of operating in England and Wales, Scotland, and even in much of Ireland, and it has become notorious. It shows that Cromwell was a man of his times with strong anti-Catholic views. It shows that he was locked into, by then, a well-established and, in our eyes, sickening cycle of violence.
Shortly after the slaughter at Drogheda, the town of Wexford became the scene of a similar tragic sequence of events.
Often twinned with the massacre at Drogheda is the so-called massacre almost exactly a month later at Wexford. The circumstances are rather different. Whereas at Drogheda, Cromwell, as an act of policy, had deliberately decided to kill defenders en masse. At Wexford, he seems to have been open to a negotiated surrender, and indeed he and his officers were in the process of trying to negotiate a peaceful handover when, prematurely and before terms had been reached, some of the defenders threw down their weapons and allowed his troops in. So the English troops massed in, not under control, and huge bloodletting is unleashed there. It probably wasn't Cromwell's design from the outset as it had been at Drogheda. It also has to be said, however, that he didn't go out of his way to control his men very quickly.
Behind him, Oliver Cromwell left a lasting legacy of bitterness and hatred in Ireland that endures to this very day. Succeeding generations remember the curse of Cromwell only too well, a view firmly at odds with Cromwell's own belief that the bloodshed had been a marvellous great mercy. The job in Ireland had been done, but the victory was ultimately to prove hollow. Writing nearly 300 years later, the eminent historian C.H. Firth noted that,
"In truth, Cromwell did much harm and little good in Ireland. Of Drogheda and Wexford, their memory still helps to separate the two races Cromwell wished to unite."
whatever the truth, it had been one of English history's most brutal episodes.
The brutality exerted in Ireland, the rigorous prosecution of Catholics and the enforcement of implantation of Protestant religion succeeded only in creating a two-tier system which saw the native Irish deprived of their birthright, and it only instituted a long-term and very, very deep-seated resentment of Protestantism and the English in general.
Cromwell initially seems to have envisaged having conquered Ireland, some form of a more peaceful settlement that would have brought benefits as well as costs to Ireland. But it has to be said that later on he and other English politicians ruled Ireland with a rod of iron, and that things like the mass confiscation of Catholic property, the dispossession of large numbers of the majority population, mean that the treatment of Ireland by Cromwell, the treatment of Ireland by the English Republic, has justifiably a fairly dim reputation, certainly in Ireland and against many historians in England and Wales and Britain as a whole.
Fresh from his exploits in Catholic Ireland, Cromwell now moved to confront the Protestant Scots. Ironically, Scotland was now the sworn enemy of the Parliamentary forces with whom they had united to defeat Charles in the Civil War only 3 years previously. There had been genuine outrage in Scotland at the execution of King Charles I. Having joined with Parliament to rid the country of those that advised and counselled the king, the Scots certainly had no further quarrel with the monarch himself. They had also been duped by Parliament into believing that the Scottish Presbyterian religion, would be established as the official state religion in England as the price of their support in the Civil War. By 1650, the hollowness of that promise had become clear, and relations between the two sides had completely broken down.
There was never any doubt that the new English Republic would try and reconquer Ireland. It was a rebellious state over which England claimed control. Scotland, on the other hand, was a separate independent nation over which the English Republic claimed no right of sovereignty. And thus the perspective was that there was no need for it to go to war. They could be friendly allies, as they had been in the 1640s, to independent Protestant nations. But after the execution of Charles I, the Scots had decided to crown his eldest surviving son, and they decided to declare him not only King of Scotland, but also King of England, and that was a threat.
The dark clouds of war gathered once more.
Cromwell's open-handedness in achieving his stated aim of the New Jerusalem, and including the Jews, went against everything that the Presbyterians stood against. It broke the Solemn League and Covenant that even Cromwell had signed. The Scots realised that they'd probably exchanged one king for another at this point, and this was exploited by Charles II.
The young Prince Charles was brought to Scotland from the Low Countries in order to sign the covenant that confirmed his acceptance of the Presbyterian religion, and the Scots began to form the army that would invade England.
Charles II, as he was calling himself and as the Scots were calling him, had a strange attitude towards religion throughout his life. Some historians suggest that he didn't have a deep personal faith, that he could be flexible, he just wanted the maximum out of religion, the church, right through to his deathbed. At this time, he certainly seems to have had no love for Presbyterianism, for a number of reasons, but partly because under the Presbyterian system there is very little power or control for the head of state. It's a bottom-up, not a top-down system. But nonetheless, he must take the covenant and abide by Presbyterianism, otherwise the Scots will not go through with the coronation and give him military support. So having delayed as long as possible, he eventually went through and rather unhappily, unwillingly, went through the procedure of accepting Presbyterianism.
Fairfax flatly refused to go to war against his former allies. He addressed a committee of the Council of State in 1650.
I think it is doubtful whether we have a just cause to make an invasion upon Scotland. With them we are joined in the National League and Covenant. For us to enter their country and to make war upon them is that which I cannot see the justice of, nor how we shall be able to justify the lawlessness of it before God and man.
Despite Fairfax's deep reservations, Cromwell invaded Scotland, entering the country during the summer of 1650. He had planned to bring the Scots army quickly to battle, but the wily Scots commander, David Leslie, would not commit his troops. Eventually, the exhausted English army retired to Dunbar, only to find themselves quickly surrounded by Leslie's men. It was a golden opportunity for the Scots to destroy Cromwell's army once and for all. But impatient Scottish ministers forced Leslie's hand. On the 3rd of September, 1650, the Battle of Dunbar ended in disaster for the Scots. A soldier of Cromwell's army, writing after the Battle of Dunbar, remembered the zeal with which Cromwell went about his task.
Cromwell carried on with a divine impulse. He did laugh so excessively, as if he had been drunk, and his eyes sparkled with spirits.
At the end of the battle, more than 3,000 Scots had lost their lives, and 10,000 had been taken prisoner. During the following months, Charles, who had been crowned King Charles II of Scotland on New Year's Day 1651, took command of the Scots army himself, and, while Cromwell occupied the Scottish capital city of Edinburgh, he slipped across the border and made for the western counties of England.
When Charles II invaded England in 1651, he was in a really difficult position. The new model army was far larger, but Charles came south hoping, like Bonnie Prince Charlie in 1745, that there would be a mass rallying to the Stuart cause. There wasn't.
He thought that once within England, his Scottish Royalist army would acquire much more support. English people would come out in support of him, and he believed that he could, by force, return to the throne in London and regain full power.
This lack of support meant that the Royalist army was outnumbered more than 2 to 1 at Worcester, the scene of Cromwell's last battle. His army had hastened south from Scotland to meet the threat of the invading army in a battle Cromwell called God's crowning mercy.
Charles Stuart found himself and his army hemmed into Worcester, and Cromwell then took his time, and on the 3rd of September he launched his troops against Charles Stuart and the Scottish Royalists, hemmed in and outnumbered in Worcester. Charles Stuart did try and give battle, but numbers, preparation, supplies, ammunition told.
It was a small army, a greatly outnumbered army. There were about 12,000 Royalists and about 30,000 in Cromwell's force.
The day ended with a complete, unmitigated, unlimited military success for Cromwell's parliamentary forces.
Once Charles had been defeated, he fled. Sensibly so. He would probably have been at the best imprisoned and maybe executed like his father had he been captured. There was a justly celebrated flight which involved heroic episodes, and these episodes are true. The story of him hiding in an oak tree is absolutely true.
With a small group of followers and in disguise, he first of all travelled around the West Midlands and then headed south to take boat to take him to the continent, having many adventures that he retold and probably elaborated years later to anyone who would listen, including on one occasion Samuel Pepys.
Charles gets away and Cromwell is able to pursue his course in England without having to worry too much about Royalist threats.
Battles of a different nature now lay ahead for the man who believed himself to be a mere instrument of God's will. This time, the struggles were not military but political, and they were to prove as difficult as any Cromwell had faced on the field of battle. In 1651, with his years of military struggle behind him, Cromwell was believed to be the man who should set about the task of the great Reformation in church and state in England. Since 1648, the country had been governed by what was known as the Rump Parliament. This group of 60 men was the remnant of the Long Parliament of 1640 that had somehow survived the various coups, plots, fighting and changes of allegiance in the intervening 11 years. The Council of State, to which Cromwell was re-elected in November 1651, was the Rump Parliament's executive. Elections for a new parliament were long overdue, but the unpopular Rump, used to unfettered power and with its own financial interests most in mind, was in no hurry to dissolve itself. The Perpetuation Act, which gave Rump members a power of veto, and which not even the most ardent Royalist would have dared contemplate, further increased the government's unpopularity throughout the country and among the army. Finally, in April 1653, Cromwell lost patience. Forewarned of a parliamentary plot to relieve him of his command of the army, Cromwell prepared for the parliamentary debate on the issue by placing 30 of his trusted musketeers in the lobby of the House. As the bill was read out, Cromwell said nothing. But as the Speaker proposed that the motion be passed, Cromwell rose to his feet to speak.
I thank the members of this noble House for the great care and pains it has formerly taken with regard to the public good in the early years of its sitting. However, in recent years your love of good works hath turned to a love of injustice, delays of justice, self-interest, and other faults. Do you have a heart to do anything for public good? You have espoused the corrupt interest of presbytery and lawyers who were the supporters of tyranny and oppression. Perhaps you think this is not parliamentary language. I confess it is not. Neither are you to expect any such from me. It is not fit that you should sit as a parliament any longer. You have sat long enough, unless you had done more good. Come, I will put an end to your prating. You are no parliament. I say you are no parliament. I will put an end to your sitting. Call them in. Call them in.
With that, the members of the Rump Parliament were ushered from the House by Cromwell's soldiers. Cromwell picked up the mace that symbolised the Speaker's authority. Passing the mace to one of his soldiers, he said,
"What shall we do with this? Here, take it away."
The Rump Parliament did not meet Cromwell's needs for a number of reasons, but also there was an air of failure about them in the early 1650s, because while Cromwell's forces had been uniting the British Isles, the Rump Parliament had become involved in a lengthy war with the leading economic power in Europe, the Dutch, the so-called First Anglo-Dutch War, and it wasn't a war that had gone brilliantly well. It was also expensive.
Cromwell believed that the Rump Parliament were rushing through a government bill that would allow for open, free, uncontrolled elections that would return a perhaps pro-Royalist or at least anti-army parliament, and he didn't want that. He wanted a parliament, but it had to be a controlled parliament, and he believed that the government bill didn't give security for the future election. More generally, he expelled the Rump Parliament because he and his military colleagues had lost patience with the Rump. Instead of pressing ahead with godly reformation and the sort of religious, political, constitutional programme that Cromwell and the army wanted and that they believed God wanted, the Rump had dragged its feet and achieved very little. It's another example of how from time to time Cromwell and the army intervened directly in essentially civilian government, removing one form of government that wasn't achieving their ends, or they would say God's ends, but then in April 1653, as earlier, not being willing to take command and control themselves, instead, after scratching their heads for a few weeks, coming up with another ostensibly civilian form of government that perhaps would do the army's and God's wills.
Little more than a decade earlier, King Charles had tried similar tactics to impose his will on Parliament and had failed miserably. This time, the House bowed to the will of Oliver Cromwell with barely a whimper. Despite his dissolution of the Rump Parliament, Cromwell seemed to have no intention of governing alone. As quickly as possible, an interim Parliament of Puritan representatives, known as the Barebone Parliament, was nominated, and this began sitting in July 1653.
The nominated assembly, the little parliament, the Parliament of Saints, the Barebones Parliament, whatever we call it, from July to December 1653, was another of these army experiments, a non-elected parliament appointed by the Council of Officers to do the army's will. It was to sit for perhaps 2 years, maybe give way to another shorter-lived nominated assembly, and then his view was that at some time, perhaps in the mid-1650s, the people would see the achievements of the nominated assembly and England would be in such a state that they could return to normal parliamentary elections, a normal elected parliament.
It is, like many of the bodies created, many of the groupings created in the English Civil War, prone to quarrelling with itself, which is not surprising because there were many issues of political order, of religious settlement, which were indeed very difficult issues.
The nominated assembly proved itself to be horribly divided between radicals and conservatives. The solid achievements, few and far between. Cromwell and the other army officers became increasingly worried and disillusioned about where the nominated assembly was going, and probably connived at, encouraged, induced the resignation of the nominated assembly in December 1653.
Cromwell was now back in the same lonely position he had been when he dissolved the Rump Parliament. He said,
"My power was again by this resignation as boundless and unlimited as before, all things being subject to arbitrariness, and myself a person having power over the three nations without bound or limit set. It is a story of my own weakness and folly, and yet it was done in my simplicity. I had thought that men of our own judgment, who had fought in the wars, would work with me in harmony, but it was not to be."
With only the other army generals alongside him, Cromwell reluctantly accepted the written constitution known as the Instrument of Government. He flatly refused, however, to become king, taking only the title Lord Protector.
Parliament offers Cromwell the crown. They wanted to become king as part of a new, slightly revised written constitution. But eventually, having agonised for several weeks, he rejects it firmly. Parliament accept that. The slightly revised constitution is accepted with him continuing as Lord Protector, not king.
Although some of his supporters were willing to, support him to be monarch, there was just not enough support across the whole political spectrum. In particular, a number of the generals were genuinely unhappy with the idea of a revival of monarchy.
Another answer would be that Cromwell was fearful that taking the crown would be a sign of personal ambition. It would increase accusations that were already circulating that he didn't want godly reformation or other ends, he just wanted his own glorification.
But I also think Cromwell's position itself is important. He didn't see himself as monarch, and in some respects, a monarch was a secular figure which was an infringement on his view of the kind of God-given authority that ought to prevail.
He might also have feared that in taking the crown he would be pushed too far in a conservative direction, that the ideal of radical godly reformation would be reduced, would be put back. He would be weaned away from it by the conservative politicians.
Cromwell's honourable intentions were also made clear when he swore an oath accepting the new constitution. New elections to Parliament were to be held in 1654, but until then, Cromwell would rule alone.
"I do promise in the presence of God that I will not violate or infringe the matters and things contained therein, but to my power observe the same and cause them to be observed, and shall in all other things, to the best of my understanding, govern these nations according to the laws, statutes, and customs thereof, seeking their peace, and causing justice and law to be equally administered."
The Protectorate was probably the most durable and one of the most long-lasting of these constitutional experiments of the interregnum 49 to 60. It lasts from December 1653 through until the spring of 1659, so it lasts a bit over 5 years. It's also the first and last time in our history when we've had a written constitution, and the constitution was very clear in setting out a division of powers. Although there was to be a single head of state called the Lord Protector, that head of state was to share his powers with others. There were to be elected parliaments from time to time, and there was also a permanent executive council with whom he would have to work. And we know it's an interesting feature of Cromwell's character and personality. He was very worried by political power. He was very fearful that it would corrupt him. And so Cromwell, I believe, went out of his way to work in accordance with this constitution, and that although as head of state he had considerable powers, he did, I believe, in practice operate government as head of state in coordination with council or parliament during the time of his protectorate.
Despite Cromwell's emotional commitment to Parliament, the seductive allure of the unrestricted power left its mark on Cromwell, and he was never again able to work with a Parliament. Although the elections had been held as promised, in 1655 he personally dissolved the troublesome group who had been elected as the first Parliament of the Protectorate. Cromwell had been simply unable to agree with them on key religious and constitutional issues. So it was that the Lord Protector once more ruled alone. Only this time it was by his own design. It is one of history's great ironies that Cromwell's rule over England was more tyrannical and extreme in nature than that of any royalist. Taxes were raised to pay for the army and the navy. Extremist groups such as the Levellers were put down. Troublesome judges were summarily dismissed. In 1655, it was decided that the country should be divided into 11 districts, with a major general in each responsible for law and order. This period of rule by Cromwell and his major generals was joyless and unhappy. These were dark, dour days in England, days made worse by Cromwell's controversial foreign policy.
Having brought peace to Britain, Cromwell, of course, embarked on war abroad. The big war was war with Spain, and Britain was at war with Spain from 1655 until the end of the decade.
It brought new possessions in the West Indies, including the island of Jamaica. It brought, for a time, a territorial possession on the continent, the town of Dunkirk. In military terms, it was successful and fruitful. The problem was that it was also very expensive.
The cost of developing an enormous navy, the cost of sending a large army to the continent, was one that destabilised the finances of the Cromwellian regime and, in a sense, destabilised the regime as a whole. The financial demands placed by the regime on the public became too great. The regime became unpopular.
In the summer of 1656, Cromwell was forced to recall Parliament in order to pay for the Spanish War. It was, of course, the supreme irony. In 1640, King Charles' desperate need to pay for the wars with the Scots had forced him to call the Long Parliament. That Parliament had become the King's judge and executioner. Cromwell had been a member, and now a Parliament summoned by him was about to cause another major constitutional crisis. There was, however, a promising start. Although the new Parliament urged the office of King on Cromwell and once again he refused, he accepted a new constitution that allowed him to appoint his own successor, and that established an upper chamber in Parliament, effectively a House of Lords. The wheel had now come full circle. In all but name, Cromwell had become the king that he had helped to remove with so much bloodshed. Like Charles, he also quarrelled constantly with his parliaments, disagreeing vehemently with them on key issues, until, in 1658, he angrily dissolved the second Parliament of the Protectorate, telling them, "God will judge between you and me." The Lord Protector continued his rule with an iron fist, putting down civilian plots and exerting his will over the army. Yet Cromwell was approaching the age of 60, and gradually this energetic man of action began to weary and tire. His health, once so robust, began to give way. In August 1658, there came a deep personal tragedy when Cromwell's favourite daughter Elizabeth became ill and died. The devoted father and loving family man never recovered from the shock or overcame his grief. After nominating his son Richard to succeed him, the Lord Protector himself fell ill. Completely worn out in body and spirit, his condition worsened until he slipped into a coma. On the 3rd of September 1658, on the anniversary of his great victories at Dunbar and Worcester, Oliver Cromwell breathed his last. After his death, Cromwell's much hoped-for constitutional and religious settlements were never to be achieved. In the uncertain hands of his son Richard, his protectorate survived for only 20 more months.
Richard was a country gentleman in Hampshire. He was too young to have played any significant role in the Civil War. Oliver himself was a little bit worried about his son's character. He viewed him as a bit of a wastrel. He'd run up debts. He hadn't studied as hard as Cromwell would have liked. He wasn't as godly as Cromwell would have liked. He wasn't particularly skilled. He wasn't an experienced or adroit politician and statesman. And above all, he had no real military background. The army and the army officers and the new model army put up with Cromwell as head of state. They may not always have liked everything he did. They thought at times godly reformation wasn't going forward as far and as fast as Cromwell or as they wanted. But Cromwell was always able to retain their confidence. Remember, we fought together, you can trust me, we'll live and die together. The old comradeship produced a bond of trust that just wasn't there between the army and Richard Cromwell. They dubbed him Queen Dick. They very soon lost confidence in him, and effectively in a coup d'etat, they got rid of him.
It was left to General Monk, the commander of the army in Scotland, to march south to persuade the Long Parliament to dissolve itself. There was no resistance from the new model army. They, too, were worn out with fighting, and they sensed the mood of the country for a peaceful settlement. A new Parliament was elected, and their first act was to invite Prince Charles back from the Low Countries to rule as Charles II. Charles had already stated his willingness to settle all grievances with Parliament in the Declaration of Breda. On the 25th of May, 1660, a tall, dark, 30-year-old man landed at Dover. He made his way through Kent and, travelling on to London, entered the city to the cheers of a joyful population. Charles II had returned as king, and the monarchy had been restored.
It would have been surprising to contemporaries to be told that Charles II would become king in England within 2 years. But Cromwell left a legacy of poor relations between political groupings that were loyal to the regime, as well as a widespread disaffection with the regime itself.
After Oliver's death, no one could repeat the trick of holding the army in check with a civilian regime. Thereafter, there's increasing chaos and anarchy. A large number of power brokers in England, military, political, some of them former Royalists, some of them former parliamentarians, come to see that only the restoration of a traditional monarchy can afford England and Britain as a whole the chance of a durable settlement and a new start. And that's why they looked to Charles Stuart.
Charles II was very, very different to his father. Psychologically, he was different. He was a much more amenable character and was not hung up on his father's high sense of moral commitment. But also, he had learnt an enormous amount. He had learnt from the experience of failure. Already, as a young man, he had shown himself willing, after the death of his father, to go to Scotland, to accept a Presbyterian church settlement, and to use that as a basis for invading England in 1651. Therefore, to come in 1660 in a settlement which was what was offered him, the so-called Restoration settlement, did not appear to him too terrible a fate.
Cromwell was a military genius whose political skills never matched his abilities on the battlefield. In peacetime, his rule brought little but more confusion and anarchy. While this simple analysis might be true in the short term, Cromwell left a political legacy. For the restoration of the Stuart dynasty was to prove merely an interlude, and the glorious revolution of 1688 restored many of the values of the Protectorate. Thanks in part to Cromwell and the Puritan Revolution, by the year 1688, Britain was poised on the verge of greatness.
Cromwell's Protectorate laid the basis for strands that emerged and re-emerged a bit later in English and British history, such as an expansionist, successful foreign policy, such as broad toleration for Protestants, broad liberty of conscience for Protestant groups. Those sort of features re-emerged and perhaps owe their origins to the work of Cromwell as Lord Protector. The English Revolution of the mid-17th century was in some ways a temporary, incomplete, reversed revolution. It was the second, much briefer and ostensibly less revolutionary revolution, the Glorious Revolution, that brought to fruition many of the earlier seeds that Cromwell and his colleagues had sown and significantly changed the course of English and British history.
So, for all its troubles and problems, it seems the Commonwealth and Protectorate had achieved greatness. Its chief architect, Oliver Cromwell, the common man who emerged as a military and political giant, left behind a legacy far beyond the permanence of parliamentary rule in Britain. However, the bitter civil war had deeply scarred the soul of the nation.
The English Civil War was in many senses the most traumatic set of events in English history. It led to a total overthrow of the political system, culminating in the execution of the King, the destruction of the House of Lords, the purging successively of the House of Commons. It led to a religious overthrow, an overthrow of the Church of England, and it led in part to social radicalisation. It led to groups in society who were not from the highest orders, who were not aristocrats, who were not gentry, seizing power. And it was always, as it were, a warning against monarchy or any government pushing matters too far.
There had been almost 3 years of hard and bitter fighting before the Battle of Naseby in June 1645. Now, after the calamitous Royalist defeat, the determination that had sustained the King's cause thus far had all but disappeared. Only the Royalist cavalry had escaped from Naseby. The remainder of the King's army, his infantry and his artillery, had been either destroyed or captured during the battle. The parliamentarians had in their possession private papers that proved beyond all doubt that the King had been intriguing with foreign powers, confirming his reputation for duplicity. King Charles, a man not to be trusted, was now a fugitive in his own kingdom. After the Battle of Naseby, ordinary people throughout the land believed that the war was very close to its conclusion. Parliament had tried everything in its power to bring it to an end by negotiation, but the differences between the two distinct factions among the parliamentarian forces surfaced once again.
The Battle of Naseby of June 1645, fought in Northamptonshire, was a major victory for Parliament. And with that, some historians see the rest of the Civil War as a grand mopping up operation. The war wasn't over. The king possessed other territory and other armies within England and Wales still, but effectively the Royalist forces were broken and Parliament was clearly on the upper hand.
There were, as ever, two very different ways in which to proceed. There were attempts to bring the king once more to the negotiating table. It was the peace party, the Presbyterian majority in the Commons, led by Denzil Hollis, that pursued these attempts most vigorously. This, though, was not the preferred route of the army, the other parliamentarian faction, whose supporters were known as independents. They believed it necessary to disable the king completely to prevent him from further pursuing the war. Only then, they reasoned, should negotiation with the king begin. Time and events did not heal the rift between the factions on the parliamentary side. Indeed, relations between the sides were to get very much worse.
There are those who favour a broad religious settlement, tolerate all the Protestant groups that had sprung up, don't restore a Church of England. There are also the hawks in political and constitutional terms, tie Charles down, further limitations. Against them are the so-called Presbyterians, who do favour the restoration of a single state church. They want to do away with what they see as many of the heresies that had sprung up during the Civil War years. And they also tended to be the people who wanted a soft deal for the king.
With an increasingly small band of followers, Charles wandered feebly throughout the country in the vain hope of rallying more troops to his cause. He still hoped to join forces in Scotland with his loyal and valiant servant, the Marquis of Montrose. But in September came the devastating news that the Marquis had been the victim of a surprise attack and had been defeated at Philiphaugh. King Charles was now the forlorn figure of popular legend, a man who, because of his stubbornness, arrogance and duplicity, would eventually make his way to the scaffold. Now was the time for a pragmatic and realistic approach. Although he had been comprehensively defeated, he was king still, and, after all, the parliamentarians had taken up arms not against him personally, but against his hated advisers, who were now scattered or captured or dead. Given the sad events of the next few years, perhaps it would have been better had the unhappy monarch gone to a hero's death at Naseby amid the wreck of his last army.
The king's options after Naseby were severely limited. His army, such as it was, consisted mainly of cavalry. It was little more than a large bodyguard. A Civil War army needs infantry and it needs a supply train. You need infantry to take the ground, you need the supply train to attack a position, both of which had been lost as a result of the battle.
He could surrender there and then, but that wasn't Charles's way. He could fight on in England and Wales, hoping to delay things, to score whatever victories he could. He could look to secure further reinforcements from Ireland, building upon the cessation, the truce he had made with the Irish Catholics 2 years before. He could perhaps make a closer military alliance with the Irish Catholics, which would actually bring over large numbers of Irish Catholic forces to fight for him to bolster his position in England and Wales. And there's clear evidence, despite the dismay of many of his own supporters, that that's exactly what he was trying to do during 1645. In fact, it never came to very much. And so instead, Charles just struggled on with now depleted forces, clear to an increasing number of people that he would lose the civil war in England and Wales, but he fought on for another year until the bitter end, until he had no option whatsoever but to surrender.
One of the final Royalist strongholds to fall was the seat of the Marquis of Winchester at Basing. The garrison had, since 1643, resisted numerous attacks by the Parliamentarians. With all hope of relief gone, it could have been forgiven for offering to surrender. Despite the hopelessness of the situation, the Marquis refused to yield, and on the 4th of October 1645, soldiers of the new model army stormed the garrison before burning Basing House to the ground. It was a bloody and pitiless episode. For the king, catastrophe soon followed disaster. Terrible news came that Bristol, the last Royalist seaport and the centre of production for Royalist armaments, had surrendered to Parliament on the 10th of September. The king's nephew, Prince Rupert, a tireless and faithful servant to the crown, knew full well that his weary army would be unable to resist the Parliamentarian forces that had, in any event, already captured some of the defences of the city.
Prince Rupert surrendered Bristol because he had a firm grasp of military realities. He was faced with armies closing in on him from all sides. There was little hope of support from the King's army, such as it was. He was also a politician, and he knew that any Royalist support for the future would depend on the people of the country. So rather than expose his own army and the citizens of Bristol to storms such as he'd used himself, he decided, by using the laws of war, to negotiate a surrender, maintain his army and take it to the king, and preserve the city and the people.
Charles was furious at the news of the loss of the city, and the darker side of his character emerged as he wrote a letter removing Prince Rupert from his command and dismissing him into exile. It was a very poor reward indeed for a young man who, if at times had been impetuous and reckless, had also proved himself to be loyal and brave.
After one that is so near me as you are, both in blood and friendship, submits himself to so mean an action, I give it the easiest terms, such I have so much to say that I will say no more of it, only lest rashness of judgment be laid to my charge. I must remember you of your letter of the 12th of August, whereby you assured me that if no mutiny happened, you would keep Bristol for 4 months. Did you keep it 4 days? Was there anything like a mutiny? More questions might be asked, but now I confess to little purpose. My conclusion is to desire you to seek your subsistence until it shall please God to determine of my condition somewhere beyond seas, to which end I send you herewith a pass, and I pray God to make you sensible of your present condition, and give you means to redeem what you have lost, for I shall have no greater joy in a victory than a just occasion without blushing to assure you of my being your loving uncle and most faithful friend.
After capturing Bristol, Thomas Fairfax marched his army into the West Country and cleared it of the king's supporters in a brisk campaign. Throughout a desperate winter, the final few Royalist outposts collapsed completely, and faithful servants of the cause such as Goring and Hopton were forced to flee to the continent. At length, even the ever-optimistic Charles came to recognise the hopelessness of his position. After leaving Oxford disguised as a servant for an aborted escape overseas, the king surrendered himself to the Scots army near Newark in Nottinghamshire on the 5th of May 1646. If, even at this late stage, Charles had harboured thoughts of persuading the Scots to support him, he was soon disabused of the notion. Their first act was to compel him to order the surrender of the remaining Royalist fortresses. With that, the war should have been over. But even after the Scots went home, leaving the king a prisoner of Parliament, Charles refused to admit defeat. 2 years of plots, intrigue and counter-intrigue followed, and a final settlement was deferred time and again as the king tried to play one parliamentarian faction off against the other.
Now, at the end of the First English Civil War, there was obviously a widespread desire to put the pieces back together again. And in many senses, in theory, it should have been possible to do so. In theory, it should have been possible to demobilise the armies, to persuade a chastened king to govern in accordance with what Parliament wanted, to reach a settlement that would suit the Scots. But in fact, the history of the years from the end of the First Civil War in 1646 right through to the execution of Charles I in London in 1649 was a period of enormous flux in which it was proved impossible to put the pieces together again.
The Presbyterian Parliament was still disposed to accommodate the king, but the army, which was dominated by independents, became increasingly impatient with the slippery monarch. Concerned over its power and influence, Parliament tried to have the army disbanded, but the move failed, and it was they, along with their new champion, Oliver Cromwell, who were to have the last say.
Army leaders had become more assertive politically in the last stages of the war, and in particular the creation, as it were, of a national parliamentary army, the new model army, as opposed to the earlier forces, and of an army in which there was a degree of officer politicisation, meant that there was another group at the negotiating table. And the army both had demands that were specific to itself. Crucially, it wanted its arrears paid, and it was owed a lot of money, and nobody could afford that. But it also had, although here army officers differed, and there was also an important differing among some elements of the rank and file, it also had particular political strategies it wished to push. And in particular, there was a resistance to the idea of a Presbyterian church settlement.
So, for the time being, the latter half of 46, first half of 1647, Charles I is almost sidelined. He's kept on a back burner. As a preliminary to doing the sort of deal they want to do with him, the political Presbyterians in Parliament know that first of all they must neutralise, get rid of the parliamentary army. And that's why there's a plan to disband a fair bit of it and to get much that remains over to Ireland to fight there, well out of the way. They fear that the parliamentary armies will intervene directly, physically, in their political plans for the future of church-state constitution.
Even though they had won a comprehensive victory over his forces, the army still recognised King Charles as their rightful sovereign. They had taken the field in order to curb the arbitrary excesses of his government, which they attributed to his wicked advisers. Now that the advisers had been dispensed with, the army assumed that it would be possible to negotiate a new constitutional and religious settlement with the king that would be acceptable to all parties. Oliver Cromwell was one of the many who believed this to be true, and, in earnest good faith, he continued the protracted negotiations with the defeated monarch, who was, nonetheless, still head of state. More trouble came, not in the shape of the king, but of Parliament. Cromwell discovered that they had been plotting to beat their own army. Incensed by their scheming, Cromwell sent a troop of horse to bring the king into army protection at the camp at Newmarket. He was, quite simply, kidnapped.
During 1647, Parliament was planning to disband as much as it could of the parliamentary armies. What it planned to do was to pay them off, pay some but not all of the arrears of pay to much of the army. Almost all the units that were to remain in being were to be shipped off to Ireland to fight there to help put down the Irish Catholic rebellion and restore English political control over Ireland. And there was also, part of the plan was that apart from the overall Commander-in-Chief, Sir Thomas Fairfax, no other officer above the rank of colonel was to remain stationed in England and Wales. So people like Cromwell, Lieutenant General Cromwell, would have no future military role or career within England and Wales, either serve in Ireland or that's the end of his military career. It's hard to see how the Presbyterian majority in Parliament thought they would get away with it. The New Model Army and the Western Army and also a Northern Army were there en masse, many thousand men. They were increasingly politicised, they made their views clear in military declarations and other army documents. A clash was clearly looming in the spring of 1647, and at times some of the Presbyterians in Parliament do hold back, but nonetheless their desire to do a religious, political, constitutional deal with Charles was such, their fear that if the parliamentary army got the upper hand, they would impose a political religious settlement so obnoxious to them that they were determined to gamble, to push ahead, even though that they were taking a huge risk and were in danger of suffering the sort of rebuff from the parliamentary army that eventually they got.
King Charles was, understandably, highly amused and much encouraged by these latest developments. It was a supreme irony. Parliament could no longer control its own army. Surely, he reasoned, it was only a matter of time before the rebel factions fell out altogether and the Royalist cause would triumph after all. The army travelled towards London, lodging their increasingly confident royal captive at Hampton Court.
The joker in the pack is the king, because having lost the war, Charles I intends to win the peace. He sees, doesn't need to be particularly bright to do this, he sees the rivalry between the other groups, and he is determined to exploit that rivalry in order to secure the return of himself to considerable power. He doesn't wish to be a figurehead king, which was the role that was intended for him by the parliamentarians.
Now came a final opportunity to find a compromise solution. The army presented Charles with a proposal for a settlement more generous than he, perhaps, had a right to expect. This was the famous heads of the proposals, the acceptance of which would have saved the king from the scaffold. Arrogant as ever, Charles rejected the proposal out of hand.
The deal drawn up, the document drawn up by Ireton and other senior officers was as lenient as it could be in the circumstances. It was very lenient towards former Royalists. Most were to be pardoned or merely excluded from public office for a period of a few years. There were to be biennial parliaments with redistributed seats. Reflecting the independent platform, there was to be a broad religious settlement with broad toleration of all Protestant groups. But to the king, it was surprisingly close to the Presbyterian platform, not the independent platform. The king was to remain, he was to retain a lot of power. For a period of 10 years, he was to share with Parliament certain key powers, such as command over the armed forces, appointment to senior offices. But thereafter, although a degree of sharing power was to be retained, the king would regain a fair share of royal power, royal prerogative. But like all the deals offered to the king at the time, Charles neither said yes nor no. He said maybe. We now know from documents that have been captured and come to light, he was not sincere. He referred to various attempts to make a deal with him as mock treaties. He was merely spinning out time, divide and rule, and if not, if it did end up at the block, then he would go there as the royal martyr.
There was now a very grim mood indeed inside Cromwell's army, as Richard Baxter, a Parliamentarian soldier, recalled in 1648.
As soon as I came to the army, Oliver Cromwell coldly bid me welcome, and never spoke one word to me more while I was there. Not once, all that time, vouchsafed me an opportunity to come to the headquarters where the councils and meetings of the officers were, so that most of my designs were thereby frustrated.
Cromwell and the army leaders had struggled to reach an agreement with King Charles, but it seemed nothing was able to persuade him to settle. Cromwell's position was made more difficult by pressure from the army rank and file, whose radical demands were represented by the army levellers. One of their demands was that all negotiations with the king should cease. Another was the abolition of the monarchy. The king was simply unaware of the growing depth of feeling against him and his cause. Cromwell's disappointment and frustration turned to anger when, early in 1648, he first discovered that Charles had been secretly negotiating with the Scots. Trouble had been brewing within the new model army, which had still not been paid since the end of the war, and Charles had hoped to engineer a final split between the army and Parliament. The plan was to take advantage of the split by marching a Scots army 10,000 strong into England. The price of the Scots support was Charles' guarantee to establish Presbyterianism in England. The secret pact was known as the Engagement, and it was to be further supported by a popular Royalist uprising throughout the country. At the end of October 1647, Charles agreed terms with the Scots, and on the 11th of November, he once again broke his word and escaped from Hampton Court.
Charles's escape from Hampton Court was very convenient for the army officers. It meant that the disagreeable, divisive negotiations they had been conducted with him could be terminated. It meant that they could pull the army together. We're all against a common enemy now, boys. And it means that the incipient mutinies and divisions of autumn 1647 could be healed over. It was very convenient. And thus there are those who suggest that perhaps Cromwell, perhaps some of the other senior officers, actually encouraged, egged on, deliberately allowed Charles to make a run for it. What I think gives the lie to those suggestions is what Charles could then have done. If he was a free agent, why did he not flee to the continent? Why did he not take boat somewhere? He would have had a perfectly honourable, welcoming reception in, say, France, could have raised forces there. He could have been a major threat in due course. And instead, we know from accounts that the Parliamentary High Command, Cromwell and others, were amazed, delighted, relieved when the news reached them that Charles had done no more than take boat to the Isle of Wight. It made no real sense. Charles seems to have thought that the governor of the Isle of Wight would be receptive to him, was a closet royalist, that he could then set up the Isle of Wight as a royalist base just offshore to mount a re-invasion. If so, he horribly miscalculated. Although the governor of the Isle of Wight was far from amused and was uncertain and worried, he remained loyal to Parliament, and Charles merely swapped confinement at Hampton Court for confinement at Carisbrooke Castle on the Isle of Wight.
Incredibly, the king had managed to engineer a second civil war in the country. His agents agitated in traditional royalist areas, promising the support of the Scottish army. On the 23rd of March 1648, the garrison at Pembroke in Wales declared for the king, in the rather naive belief that he would settle their arrears of pay.
Charles plays his hand reasonably well, in that he is able to cause a second civil war in which one of the major military forces in the British Isles, namely the Scottish Army, is on his side. And this, after all, seems great. There had been 2 invasions earlier that decade by Scottish forces, both of them aimed against Charles I. One of them had precipitated the overthrow of his position and his need to turn to Parliament. The second one had helped cost him the north of England and the sort of military situation in 1644. So in many senses, the march south of the Scots in 1648 should have meant that Charles would be successful.
It would have stood a greater chance if the various regional risings in England and Wales and the Scottish Royalist invasion could have been coordinated so that they hit the Parliamentary armies, chiefly the New Model Army, at the same time and stretched resources. Given the lack of coordination, the New Model Army was able to, either as a whole unit or bits of it, pick off the various Royalist elements one by one.
Cromwell was dispatched to deal with the Welsh uprising, but a month later, more Royalist rebels seized Berwick and Carlisle, opening the way for the arrival of the Scottish army into England. At the end of May, a Royalist revolt broke out in Kent, and the navy mutinied in support of the king. The first cracks in the revolt appeared, however, when news came that fierce opposition at home had delayed the Scots' advance until July. By then, it was too late.
Although a group within Scotland had made a deal with the king, the so-called engagement, there were many within Scotland, the Kirk Party Covenanters, who were not satisfied with this deal. They felt they could not trust the king. He would not stand by the terms that he had apparently agreed to. There was significant opposition within Scotland to mounting a pro-royalist Scottish army and invading England. Much of that opposition was mere apathy. People just didn't join up, refused to cooperate. Some of it was actually physical opposition. There were minor rebellions against the Scottish Royalist Army in parts of Scotland, and they had to be quelled or controlled before that Scottish Royalist Army could march south.
Fairfax defeated the Kentish rebels at Maidstone in June 1648 and pursued the beaten Royalist fugitives north across the River Thames to besiege them at Colchester. Pembroke surrendered to Cromwell on the 11th of August, and just 3 days later, the Scots at last crossed the English border. There was not a moment to lose. Marching hard, Cromwell joined General Lambert at Wetherby, then turned westwards across the Pennines to meet the Scottish army marching southwards on London. The two armies met at Preston on the 17th of August, and it was here that Cromwell completed one of his most decisive military victories.
Swinging across from Yorkshire, Cromwell fell in behind the Scottish Royalist Army through Lancashire, and he took advantage of the failure of the command of the Scottish Royalist Army. They had become dangerously strung out as they marched through Lancashire, and when Cromwell, fell upon the rear units of that army outside Preston, some of that army was in the centre of Preston, 2 miles away, and was very slow to respond to the request that they turn about and come back and reinforce their colleagues. Much of the cavalry was even further south, well on the way to Wigan. So Cromwell's army, although outnumbered by the Scots, was able to attack only part of the army at any one stage. So he wasn't outnumbered.
The Battle of Preston was more a running engagement fought through the lanes and across the bridges of Lancashire between the Pennines and Preston, and then from Preston down to Wigan. The Scots advanced, supported by Marmaduke Langdale. They were met by Cromwell, and in the fight which took place over the next 2 days, the English infantry showed their real talent for fighting in hedgerows and lanes, and the Scots were destroyed. The consequences, certainly for the Second Civil War, Scottish intervention was ended, and Cromwell was the master of both countries.
Although the Scots continued their march south, they were in complete disarray. Abandoned by their cavalry, the army turned to face Cromwell outside Warrington, but to no avail. Cromwell himself recalled in August 1648,
"We held them in some dispute till our army came up, they maintaining the pass with great resolution for many hours, ours and theirs coming to push of pike and very close charges."
Eventually, the Scots ran out of ammunition and were forced to fall back into Warrington itself. There was some talk of fortifying the town, but without sufficient ammunition, all was lost. The great enterprise in support of the king was over, and the Scots army surrendered to Cromwell. A week later, outside the walls of Colchester, Fairfax's men triumphantly flaunted the banners taken from the Scots army at Preston. Having eaten every horse, cat and dog in the town, the defenders were starving, and their gnawing hunger was made worse by the realization that no help or support could be expected. With heavy hearts, they surrendered Colchester on the 28th of August, 1648. The Second Civil War was over, and it was time for a reckoning with the king.
Having crushed the king, the generals feel that they cannot anymore trust him. They are no longer interested in being sort of observers or even parties to a deal between civilian politicians and the king. Instead, the generals, not all of them, but a powerful group among them, press for dealing with what they term the man of blood. They argue that Charles I, by encouraging the Scots to invade and by encouraging the Second Civil War, had in effect broken every understanding, and that he himself was a figure who should be understood not as some politician to make a deal with, but as the kind of evil personified in what one might term a kind of biblical view of the world.
As a response to that, the Presbyterian majority within Parliament itself says this is terrible. What we must do is hurry up and make a compromise deal with the king, no matter what, preferably while the New Model Army is still away on campaign. And so, ironically almost, the Second Civil War gives an impetus to the political Presbyterians in Parliament to reopen negotiations with the king on the Isle of Wight. They send delegates down to Newport on the Isle of Wight, and they attempt to reach a fairly soft, quick compromise deal with the king, the Treaty of Newport, to try and resolve everything and to bring back the king in full power to London before the New Model Army knows about it, can do anything to stop it, can push ahead its very different and far more brutal agenda.
The simple truth was that King Charles was a man who would not yield his personal position. He still clung doggedly to the principles that he had taken onto the battlefield in 1642. The great constitutional issues of the day, therefore, remain unsolved. No one on the parliamentary side had intended that the war should end in a way that presented so stark a choice, but the realization gradually dawned that the only lasting solution to the country's problems lay in the abolition of the monarchy and the execution of the sovereign. Naturally, nobody was particularly keen to be the first to voice publicly what was felt by many privately. It fell to Oliver Cromwell to grasp that poisoned chalice and to lead the way. Cromwell had once done all in his power to reach agreement with the king, but Charles had thrown that goodwill back in his face. Now, Cromwell was the king's implacable enemy, certain that it was God's will that Charles should die. He made his intentions clear in a phrase that would ring down the ages.
We shall cut off the head of the king with the crown upon it.
The execution of Charles was, given the mood of the army, given the mood of the people, and the victory that Parliament had achieved, probably the only simple and reasonable option they had. To exile the king abroad would mean that he could cause trouble from the continent. To pardon the king or to return to a status quo would have angered Parliament's army, who would have gone on the rampage. To have returned to the status quo from Parliament's point of view would have been unthinkable. So the only thing they could do, the most extreme solution but the most logical option, was to execute the king.
Cromwell now pursued his goal with the ruthless efficiency that had become his trademark on the battlefield. Recognizing that he was unlikely to enjoy the support of the Presbyterian majority in the House, who were in favour of continuing negotiations with the king, he hit upon an ingenious way of ensuring that they did not stand in his way. He prevented them from taking their seats in Parliament.
Having defeated the Scots, the army is now seeing force as the way forward. Parliament is purged. Pride's Purge, named appropriately enough after an army officer.
Colonel Pride refuses to allow into the Commons chamber a large number of MPs, those who had proved themselves antagonistic to the Parliamentary army, to the Parliamentary army's military, constitutional, political, religious agenda, and those who had proved themselves too friendly towards the king, wanting to do a deal with him on the terms half agreed at Newport. And so there is a mass purge. Some are actually trundled off and imprisoned for a while. Many more are simply turned away. Others, although not physically expelled, don't like what's happening and absent themselves. So from a house which in theory numbered over 500, in the wake of Pride's purge, the military purge of the House of Commons, in the succeeding weeks, probably no more than 70 MPs take their seats. They're the more radical MPs, the independents. They're the MPs friendly to the Parliamentary army and friendly towards the idea of exemplary justice against Charles Stuart, that man of blood.
It was on the 20th of January, 1649, that one of the most dramatic and tragic episodes in British history began. The culmination of years of rancour and bitterness that had precluded any compromise between the two sides. It was an utterly unique situation, for there was certainly no legal precedent whatsoever that provided for a king to be tried and executed by his own subjects for supposed acts of treason against his people.
Some historians suggest that several months before, many of the senior army officers, including Cromwell, had determined that, assuming they won the Second Civil War, trial and execution, regicide was the only option, and that it's merely the convenience of securing the victory in the war, Pride's purge, and that determines the precise timing of it in January 1649. Other historians suggest no, that there were options and that some of the senior army officers were hesitant and wished to explore other options. One option might be to depose Charles, or perhaps more realistically to persuade him to abdicate in favour of one of his younger sons, who would be some sort of a puppet regent in name only. And historians debate whether the execution was the only alternative, and some suggest that until really quite late, Cromwell and other key military and political players in the trial and execution hesitated and looked at alternative routes.
All his life, Charles had cut a rather reticent, uncharismatic figure, hindered by his slight speech impediment. His trial, ironically, was to be the finest hour of his public life. His stammer miraculously left him, and he won new admiration and respect from among even his most bitter opponents by his steadfast and dignified defence of his position and principles.
I would know by what authority, and I mean lawful authority, I am to be tried. There are many unlawful authorities in the world, such as thieves and robbers on the highway, which have the same authority as this assembly. Do not forget that I am your sovereign king, ordained by God to rule his people. By that authority, I stand more for the liberty of my people than any that come here to be my pretended judges. You have shown no lawful authority to satisfy any reasonable man. If I am not suffered to speak, what justice shall my people have? I have a trust committed to me by God. By old and lawful descent, I will not betray it to answer to a new, unlawful authority. Therefore resolve me that, and you shall hear more of me.
After the first eloquent and elegant speech to the court in his own defence, during which he refused to recognise the authority of the court, Charles was not allowed to speak again. It was an extraordinary state of affairs that confirmed the trial was little more than a charade by which Cromwell hoped to give the dubious proceedings an air of legality. There were many bitter exchanges during the first day of the King's trial. John Cook, the Parliamentary lawyer, said in his opening address that Charles had been
trusted with a limited power to govern by and according to the laws of the land, and not otherwise. He had attempted to erect and uphold in himself an unlimited and tyrannical power, and had traitorously and maliciously levied war against the present Parliament and the people therein represented. The said Charles Stuart is a tyrant, traitor, and murderer, and a public and implacable enemy to the Commonwealth of England.
Charles' reaction to these words hardly helped the highly charged atmosphere in court. He gave a loud and scornful laugh. Opinion was divided among the public as to the King's fate. As Cook returned home on the evening of the first day of the trial, a neighbour stopped him.
"I hear you are up to your ears in this business,"
said the friend.
"I am serving the people,"
replied Cook.
"There's 1,000 to 1 will not give you thanks,"
came the answer. Cook's final words to his friend, however, illustrated clearly the determination of the King's opponents to see him executed.
"He must die, and the monarchy must die with him."
In many ways, the trial of the King is a show trial. Like most of the state trials in 16th and 17th century England, it's not about determining guilt or innocence. It's to show that the accused is guilty and then to sweep on to what follows. And it's in much the same way as the trial of the regicides themselves 11 or 12 years later, in a similar vein. The fact that Charles, instead of pleading, instead of mounting any defence, merely refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of the court, speeded things up a bit, but probably had no effect on the outcome. Guilty, to be executed.
The execution of King Charles I was set for Tuesday the 30th of January, 1649. The final days of the King's life were devoted to prayer and religious contemplation, save for a heartbreaking final meeting with Elizabeth and Henry, two of his children, on the 29th of January. The 13-year-old Elizabeth wept bitterly as the King spoke to the infant Duke of Gloucester.
"Mark, child, what I say. They will cut off my head and perhaps make thee a king. But you must not be king while your brothers Charles and James do live. For they will cut off thy brothers' heads when they can catch them, and cut off thy head too. And therefore I charge you, do not be made a king by them. I will be torn in pieces first."
The child replied. The end came on a grey, freezing London day. Fearing that the icy conditions would make him shiver as if through fear, the King asked for an extra shirt to wear. He was taken from St. James to the royal palace at Whitehall, the scene of so much happiness before the horrors of the war and its aftermath. When the time came, the King walked slowly and steadfastly to the scaffold, which had been erected in front of the banqueting house and was surrounded by an enormous crowd. As the axe fell, severing the King's head with one blow, a great groan went up from the crowd, a groan remembered by one young eyewitness as
"one as I had never heard before, and desire I may never hear again."
Charles died bravely on the scaffold, impeccable courage, but that's no more than would be expected from any gentleman facing the block, although there probably were provisions to tie him and hold him down if need be. It wasn't what was expected. A gentleman didn't panic. He submitted himself to what was required, courageously, bravely, and that's what Charles did. His final speech, slightly garbled and incoherent at times, but fairly coherent, and an impeccably brave death. I would argue it was a death he deserved. I would say that he was guilty of much of the Civil War, and purely practical terms, because of his duplicity, because of his unwillingness to enter into any form sincerely and to keep any form of a settlement, the parliamentarians, or some of them, were probably at least right in coming to the conclusion that there would never be a durable peace with Charles I. The only chance for peace was without him.
Cromwell's work was complete. Charles would no longer stand in the way of the will of the people. It was difficult to argue, though, that England was a more contented place. Was it the will of the people to see their king executed? And what of Parliament? Once at the beck and call of the king, now sitting only with permission of the army. It was a situation that was unwelcome as it was unforeseen. After 8 years of bloodshed and turmoil, England still looked to an uncertain future.
Force has come to England, and the basis of this force is to underlie everything that subsequently happens in the 1650s.